Wherever you are, we're really pleased to have you part of this conversation. It's really an exciting time when I think about how long it's been since I've actually been together with people live and in an actual event. Some of the people out here, I want to blur your background a little bit because that's what I'm so used to on Zoom. So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is John Mancini, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. And this event is sponsored by QAI and DocPoint and IBML and Konica Minolta. So we're really pleased to have you here. It's a really interesting time to think about this whole question of records and the M1921 deadlines and where are we. As some of you may know, that we've been in the business of doing these events for quite some time at QAI. Going back, I think, probably about 2 years now, we've been doing these events. We started off in person and then went virtual and then we went webinar, and now we've got this interesting hybrid event. So just so people know what's going on, we have folks here live at the Hamilton in downtown Washington, D.C. We also have folks phoning in from vacation at the beach. We have people from Pennsylvania. We have people from all over. So it's truly a hybrid event. And what we're focused on is this question of, when we think about some of these questions that we've gotten over the course of the last couple of years from the field about what's going on with regards to M1921. That's the structure that we put behind the event. And there are really 4 questions that we want to talk about today. And we've got speakers for each one. And it's really pretty exciting, I think, to think about what we'll hear during the course of the day here today. So first of all, what's the current state at NARA with regards to M1921? And we have probably one of the most terrific speakers on that. Lisa Haralampis from NARA will brief us on that. Secondly, we're going to talk about this whole question about migrating to an electronic environment. And in particular, what are the implications of doing that from the perspective of a records management senior person that really understands both records and information management. And Katie Perry will be doing that. Thirdly, we want to talk about one approach that an organization took to meeting the M1921 deadlines, which was to bring digitization in-house and do it at large scale. And Paul Van Reed will talk a little bit about how EPA has approached that question and some of the lessons learned along the way. And I think you'll find that practical insights that he has in terms of that entire process really interesting and really revealing about some of the issues that you ought to think about. And then the last thing that we'll talk about, we have a panel of Scott Swiderski and Sushil John, and very expert both in the question of providing solutions and in the whole question of how do you apply technology to this set of concerns that we have. And more particularly, which will be the focus of what we'll talk about, is how do you balance those short-term issues that you have to deal with. In other words, how the heck do you get rid of all those file boxes versus the long-term concerns that you want to incorporate into your plan so that you're not just scanning paper, you're also creating a digital government infrastructure moving forward. And so we have a great day. I think just logistically, just so folks know, is that you have a chat function in your Vimeo browser. That will be the way in which we get questions from the field. And so if you take a few moments and just take a look at finding where that chat button is, and you could even test it out by sending a message, that's where I'll be keeping tabs on that, and we'll be keeping an eye out for questions. In each case, we're going to take about a half hour for the presentations and reserve about 15 minutes for questions. And so we really welcome the questions. It's a very interesting inflection point in the whole journey to M1921, and I think that it'll be really good to get questions from you all about issues that you all face moving forward. The other thing I would suggest, having done this before, is look for that little full screen button on your Vimeo browser, particularly in terms of the presentations, makes things a lot easier to see, and particularly when you get into viewing the slides themselves. So, chat button and the full screen button. So, without further ado, let me introduce Lisa Haralampis. Lisa is the Director of Records Management Policy and Outreach at NARA. She has more than 24 years of experience in federal government records at NARA and at the U.S. Department of State. She is responsible for how NARA tracks, implements, and manages the Managing Government Records Directive. That's kind of the fancy, and to the extent that NARA gets involved in marketing savvy messages, that's the marketing savvy title for M1218, the first name. And because that wasn't an arcane enough name, we came up with M1921. But she is responsible for all of that. Lots of questions I know people are having about where that stands, what the status is, where are we going forward. And Lisa's one of my favorite people in the federal government. She's a whole lot of fun. I think you're going to enjoy it. Lisa Haralampis.
Thank you, John. All right, well, let me first, what a wonderful introduction. Thank you for that, and thank you to QAI for having me here today. And give me a moment to actually remember how to do this live and in person, because it has been a while. Most of my talks have been through Zoom and other online platforms. So the first thing I'm going to double check is I know how to do a slide deck. All right, we are starting. So there I am, and thank you. I appreciated being asked today to come talk about the current state of NARA's policies relating to the OMB memo and transition to electronic records management. And I'm from Outreach. Sorry about that. Got an H missing. I like to always say there's somebody new in the audience. So for those who have not heard me speak before or are new to this space, I come from the National Archives and Records Administration. I work in the Office of the Chief Records Officer for the U.S. government. We're a team of about 80 people. We work across the country, and we work in federal records management. We do policy and outreach, which is me and my team. We do oversight and reporting, and we also do training. So there is some training materials available to try to explain how agencies are managing records and what they have to accomplish. And last but not least, in any way, we do appraisal, which involves determining retention periods for federal records as part of that exercise. And I have on the slide our AC, the Office of the Chief Records Officer, vision and mission statements, because I'm hoping that you appreciate what we're looking to do is to make, all we want to do is determine what information and what records are being created in the federal government, all of it, and we want to help manage it appropriately so that we know how long it has to be retained, so that the National Archives can find the treasures that are out there and bring them into our holdings. And we want to do it in a way that individuals are not doing click and file or print and file. We're envisioning a process that is transparent to the user. Users are doing their work, but behind the scenes there's information management professionals that are helping to identify, catalog, index, preserve that information, and manage it according to regulations. So that's what we're trying to do, and part of trying to do that has been, how do we do it? Well, we do it with policies and directives. So yes, let's talk about M1921. M1921 was issued in June of 2019. Its formal name is the OMB NARA Memorandum Transition to Electronic Records. And before I talk about the target dates, I want to spend a moment or two talking about the vision, because the first part of this memo broadly directed agencies to ensure that all federal records are created, retained, and managed in electronic formats with the appropriate metadata. I think it's sometimes good to remember you can get focused on a target date and what does it mean and what are we trying to do? I like to step back and remember, well, actually what we're trying to do is be more effective and more efficient in records management by going electronic. Also, this memo had a new target that hadn't been discussed before. It talked about agencies' need to develop plans to close agency-operated storage facilities for analog records and transfer that operation to either federal record centers, which are operated by NARA, or to commercial storage facilities. So again, the goal was to become fully digital government where operations are more effective and more efficient, and we're improving on the mission delivery, on customer service, and accountable stewardship. So that's what we're trying to do. And I'd like to point out that we are members of the federal records community, NARA, together working with agencies. We've been working on these vision for the past 10 years. John mentioned M1218. What that means is that in 2012, which is where you get the 12 from, it was the 18th directive that OMB put out, and that was the first time they worked with NARA to provide this type of guidance. 10 years ago, we had the target, 10 years ago, in 2012, we wrote our first target date, which was to manage all email electronically by 2016. We also had a target date for 2019, where we said if it's a permanent record, and permanent means that record's coming to the National Archives, it'll be preserved in perpetuity as best we can. If it's permanent and it was electronic, it needs to stay electronic. So you may have heard me refer to these goals in the past as these please, please, please stop printing records for preservation. Things that are born digital should stay digital. So that's where we were in the past, and where we are right now is our new target dates. So in 2019, we came up with a few new targets. One was that by December 31st, 2022, all permanent records, whether they were born digital or in paper, would be managed in electronic format, and all temporary records would be managed in electronic format. The memo also gave agencies that same deadline to transfer inactive temporary records out of agency-operated centers into record centers, federal record centers, or commercial facilities. So what I saw as the difference is that the previous targets said, okay, you're creating records electronically, preserve them electronically going forward. Let's get out of the print and file business. But what makes these targets unique is that they also focused on the past. They said, okay, we're moving forward in that direction. Let's keep moving forward in that direction, and let's look at the big picture and try to say, what have we already created, and how can we make that electronic so that we can better manage our records? And again, it was really get out of the paper warehouse business, either by digitization or commercialization. That was the vision. So I know one of the things you wanted to hear from me today was, so that December 31st, 2022 deadline. Yeah, it's up there on the slide. The question has been, and we're sort of seeing a surge of questions about, are you going to extend those dates? So I'm sorry to say I have no news that I can share about a potential new memo to reset the 2022 target dates. I can share that NARA and OMB are still in discussions. We are still talking about the issue. And I know that's frustrating to hear today on May 24th, that December 31st deadline may or may not change. It is a will they or won't they situation. And it makes it difficult to plan, and it makes it difficult to authorize funding expenditures, because you need to know what are the dates going to be. Since there's really no news on the dates, and again, in my experience in the federal government, until something is signed, it's not done. You cannot take action on proposed ideas. So what can we take action on? In 2020, I would even step back for it. So it's 2019, OMB and NARA are working, and they've said we've got our new dates and our new targets, and that's the direction we want to head. And even while that discussion was happening, there was a recognition that all agencies for all records and all formats would be hard to meet. So the language in the memo said to the greatest extent possible. And there was information in that memo about how to request an exception. So here we are, it's June 2019, this memo's been issued. We know that agencies will not be able to hit it for in every situation. So in September of 2020, we issued a bulletin, and that bulletin number is 2020-01, It was the first piece of policy that fiscal year. And we help provide information to agencies on what you need to do for an exception request. An exception request is the language that NARA is speaking. I have had agencies ask about, oh, do you need my exception plan? I need my extension. You want a digitization plan? What is it the thing that NARA is asking for? So we are asking for agencies to formally submit us an exception request if, as a business case, and give us the information we need to make a decision on how are you going to be transitioning to electronic records management, and what exceptions do you need? What is the plan to get there? So there are 3 broad categories that come into play when we're talking about exceptions. Excuse me. We said there was a recognition that sometimes paper records management could create the transition from paper records management to electronic records management might be burdensome from the public. For me, and this is, again, it's about transition to electronic records management. If we do not have a component where people can work with the federal government services and information in paper, are we doing them a disservice? And I said, for me, I recognize that I have privilege. I have access to a computer. I have access to a broadband. I am very comfortable navigating online to get services and goods. That's not the same for every American in every place, or for even every member of the public that interacts with our government. For example, some people still file their taxes in paper. They cannot yet file their taxes electronically for a variety of reasons. Some people are still using analog inputs to request benefits from the government. So burdensome for the public would be a recognition that we can't go completely electronic in that interaction with our customers, with citizens. However, just because we may need to preserve an analog interface with the public doesn't mean that we have to process that information and retain records related to those services in paper. I think we are saying in this respect, the memo is saying if there's a burden to the public, you can keep doing part of your mission and offering those services that way. However, the processing, the achieving that vision behind the scenes would be digitized and would be electronic as a way of being more more efficient and more effective. That's the goal. We're trying to be more efficient and more effective. Another category of exceptions would be cost-benefit analysis. As federal employees, we have a fundamental responsibility to be effective stewards of taxpayer resources. As federal records managers, we have a responsibility to implement an active and continuing program for economical and efficient management of the records of the agencies. Records management is important because it helps make and preserve the records that document what the government does and protects the rights of those people whom we serve. So we know that there is an intangible benefit. We sometimes have to map that to, well, how much is the very tangible real cost of doing our work? So to help illustrate cost-benefit a little bit more in this context, I'd like to talk about the work that's been done by the Federal Records Management Council. This is a council that NARA supports. Its mission is to help identify critical issues and provide recommendations on record-keeping solutions and acceptable practices to the Archivist of the United States. So it's a closed group, and it has agency records officers, usually at the department level. And in 2019, the council set up a working group, a subgroup, and said, we want to look at the cost-benefit information related to digitization. So they produced several materials. They are available online on NARA's website. And I thought it was really interesting. At that point, they created a white paper to explain some of the digitization price and effects that need to be considered. They or I should say the decision making, how are you digitizing, what is the material, what is the nature of the records. They had this wonderful white paper to sort of help you think through what does it mean to make the decision to go forward. They also had price sheets, formulas, so it was research that was done at the time. And it was a snapshot into 2019, but I think it's very helpful because it talks about what are we looking for? And it is entirely possible that it could turn out, cost-benefit-wise, it may not be effective to digitize all records. So that gives you those resources from the council, again, help people think about their strategy for transitioning to electronic records and be able to produce some really good information on why we're going to go the way we're going and what the costs are and what the burden to the public is. And last but not least, were there any legal barriers that prevent an agency from going to fully digital government, from digitizing their materials and working electronically? And there can be. One of the classic examples we've heard is the requirement for a wet signature. So somewhere, somehow in the legislation that governs an agency mission, it says you have to have handwritten, signed signatures, and a digital signature may not be sufficient because the law is very specific. I think that is a requirement that we've heard often, but is also a requirement that is fading into the past, because we know that courts are more and more willing to accept digital information. That usually was a legal requirement driven by lawyers to say we can authenticate what we've done. And there's other ways now to make sure that we're producing records that are authentic, have integrity, and can be used in courts as evidence. So there might be those three broad categories, and I've kind of explained in great detail, I think, like what might prevent you. But what I'm hoping is that you will also see those are all challenges that can be surmounted. If you're looking at the cost and the benefit of doing good digitization, you can also balance that on the cost of doing business the way we always have. And is there efficiencies to be preserved? Are there legal issues? Well, laws can be changed and updated. And again, if there's a need to interact with the public in one analog method, that's fine. But is that how we have to manage and preserve and store that information? It is not. So there are a few other factors that should be considered when deciding if we're going to do this digitization project, how we're going to do it, and what kind of exceptions we might need until we're able to complete it. Other factors could simply be, do you have an ongoing agreement with the National Archives? Are we already in a process and discussing with you how we're going to accession records in the future? Other factors could be intrinsic value. And I like to put it this way. Oh, you know it. You know we archivists, we love a beautifully illustrated document that has a raised seal and has got a handwritten signature by a historical figure, right? That is the kind of record we want to preserve. And we still can do that because there's an ability to say, well, if there's something's got intrinsic value, we can work with agencies and accept that and get them an exception. But that is very rare. And that is not what's happening in most agencies with most records that are being produced on modern office paper. The unique physical characteristics are generally not part of what's in those boxes in those warehouses. It's the information in those records that's what's important, and it's that information we want to preserve, and it's that information we want to manage. Which is why one of the questions I get on exceptions is, yes, I hear what you're saying. You want a business case, you want it complete, you want all this information. Why don't you give me a template? Nara, if you could please provide a template, I will check all the boxes and we will move forward. I think it's important to know that given, I think I've explained, each situation is unique. There is no one size that fits all. So we have not developed a template because what we're asking for is for some strategic thinking on how am I going to make this vision of managing all of my records electronically. Tell us about that vision and the plans to achieve that vision in an exception request. And while you're also doing that, please also let us know what the disposition authority is that we're talking about, what volume of records we're talking about. We'd like to know what the date range is. And here's, to me, a critical piece of advice I've given to agencies who's asked questions about this exception. Please let me know, please let NARA know how long you're going to need an exception for. Because I believe that where we've gone so far is we're moving the entire federal government to fully digital. There's pockets, there's areas in agencies where you say, we're not there yet. The goal is to be having that strategic thinking and those plans for how I'm going to get there. Then that supports the exception request that both NARA and OMB can approve and say, yes, we understand you need a 5-year exception request to make this transition. You've requested your budgets, you've got your plan. Unfortunately, the pandemic may have delayed those plans, so now you need more of an exception. But that's our goal. To date, so we have no template, but we know what we're looking for. We're looking for strategic thinking. To date, we've had about 10 formal exception requests submitted to us. That's not that many yet. So it's an interesting. We've looked at those exception requests. We've made recommendations from my office and from sort of up our chain as to whether or not they should be approved. But NARA and OMB together have not yet formally approved any of the formally submitted exceptions. So I believe we're still looking, and I think that is still part of the debate of whether the deadlines may be extended or not. And I think it's all tied together. So please stay tuned. As soon as we have information to share about a new memo or about the exception request process getting underway and examples for people to use, we will share that. My last slide has a way of connecting with our office, and I encourage you to connect with us, to follow our blog, to sign up to receive memos, to attend bridge meetings, because that's where you'll learn the latest and greatest. We will share that with you as we can. So that's what I have to say about this bulletin with the guidance on exceptions. Again, I'm going to say over and over, I think the goal is to transform, and I think we're getting there. If you need an exception, there is a process to be put in place. So how are people doing? How are agencies going to make these deadlines? Well, we do have some reporting data that I thought I would share today. So, for those of you who don't know, NARA gathers data through our annual reporting process. We've been running the annual reporting process since 2009. It starts out in the good old days. We started out with a records management self-assessment. We would send that to all agencies governed by the Federal Records Act. That's about 270 agencies. And the reporting period generally starts in January and runs through March. So in 2021, we're asking how things worked in 2020. So we're always sort of saying this is the year report, and it covers the previous year. In addition to the RMSA, we've asked for, we have a maturity model report that we ask for information on for how agencies are doing managing their email and managing those permanent electronic records. And we have a third report that I wanted to share some information. Our third report is the Senior Agency Official for Records Management, the SAORM report. That is a narrative report. It just lets us get comments and information from those executives who are responsible for the strategic thinking of records management in their agencies. And we post them all online. And congratulations to my colleagues who work in oversight and reporting. They really did an amazing job this year. And they were able to post those SAORM reports very quickly. And so they are all currently available online. So that's where I'm getting my data from. I'm getting my data from the SAORM reports that were done in 2022, focusing on where we were in 2021. So that's what we've done. I want to share that what you're seeing here is a sneak peek. This is some statistics that we've done with our initial analysis that I wanted to share, because for me, that's the question. Are agencies going to meet the deadlines? What are they saying? So this is initial data. When we produce our final written report, I hope you'll see them again, and with the analysis that tells a little bit more of the story. But I thought today I'd share the story that I thought was fascinating. The first is that we've been asking agencies every year, are you going to meet the targets? Do you think you will meet the 2022 deadlines? And you can see there's a downward trend. We asked us 3 years ago, yeah, we'll make them, no problem. You really can do it for permanent and temporaries. Even the year after that, in 2020, we're going to make those deadlines, but there was a little decline. And this year, there's a much steeper decline. So only 66% of agencies that responded said, yes, we're going to meet those deadlines. That is the same trend we saw that happened with email in 2016. That is the same trend we saw with permanent electronic records in 2019. Ask us how we're doing 3 years out. We've got our plans, we've got our ideas, we'll think we'll get there. The closer to the deadline we become, the more, I don't know if it's just human nature. The more problems we realize, we get a little more realistic about what we're going to be able to achieve. So only 2/3 of agencies think they're going to make the targets. On the other hand, 2/3 of agencies still think they're going to meet those targets. I was fascinated by that because I didn't quite know what that meant, and I'm looking forward to reading the comments and really getting some more analysis to understand where we are. So it's perfectly normal to see that change, and I'm impressed that agencies still think they can do it. We also asked agencies in the SAORM report, are you going to need an exception? Or do you have plans to create that? We wanted to sort of get a sense of what might be coming our way. So it was really fascinating. And again, 1/3 of the responders said, oh yes, we're definitely planning to submit an exception. 1/3 of the responders said, no, we're not planning to do that. Oh no, I'm sorry, 42% said, no, we're not planning to do that. And another 30% said, I don't know, we haven't made that decision. So for all the math majors out there, I know you've done the numbers as we're talking, and you were like, Lisa, that does not equal 100. So there's something wrong with your math. What I want to point out is this is a narrative report, so we are just asking agencies what they think, and they can certainly check more than one box. So some people said no, and I don't know. Some people said, I'm going to check no, but if this scenario happens, then it's a yes. So I thought was fascinating is to see that it was evenly spread. I would not have been surprised to learn 100% of responders said, yeah, I'm going to need an exception in some way, shape, or form. But they didn't. It was no, maybe, I think we're going to make it. So we'll see what happens the closer that time becomes. We asked them, are you going to do an extension? We wanted to know we wanted to know a little bit more about that information. So in the details, we learned that agencies said, I need an exception. And other times they said, and I'm going to need an extension. And that was fascinating because our guidance didn't say anything about extensions versus exceptions. So I will be really looking forward to learning more about when my colleagues read the comments and write their reports. What did that mean? An exception versus an extension. To paint it with a really broad brush, I am interested to know if there are some agencies that are saying, I need an exception. I am never going to make that target. And again, let that be part of the business case because there's something about the mission that requires analog. Or are they really just talking, I need an extension. I'm going to need 3 years. I'm going to need 5 years. I'm going to need 10 years. So I just need an extension until I reach that point versus an exception. Having seen that data, I can tell you now we'll be working on clarity for what those plans are that are being submitted to NARA. So that was fascinating. I also thought I would share this data, this slide, because again, thank you to my colleagues for giving me a sneak peek and that I can share with you. We asked agencies, what challenges are you facing? And again, this is just initial data. It's just a preview. But what I thought was fascinating is you could see they've gone through the SAORM reports, they've looked at the types of categories of challenges agencies faced, and again, you can answer more than one. So you can say, yes, I have a challenge with COVID and with resources and with volume, the formats is a challenge for me. I found the COVID statistic to be fascinating. I wouldn't have, again, been surprised to learn that COVID was the #1 challenge agencies are facing with their records management. It did make the top 3, but it wasn't the highest challenge. So yeah, I learned the lesson again. Always ask the questions. You might be surprised of what you're assuming isn't what's the experience that people are having. So the main problem that agencies are finding, what is this challenge to transformation to electronic records? How does the challenge to doing digitization? It's what they've been saying for years. It's the skills, it's the services, it's the money. If I only had the people, the money, and the tools and the time, I could do this, but it's really hard to budget. When your agency budget is just enough to do your mission, it can be hard to justify how much money do I need to spend, where am I going to put it? So we do the best we can with the resources we have, knowing they're almost never enough. So that remains our #1, and yes, COVID is a challenge that's in there as well. Now, the other interesting item I saw from this, and I make sure, look, I'm turning around to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. The second barrier that was identified was culture. That's new. Again, I can't wait to see what this just as initial data is, but as the analysis supports that. I think that, having just said that skills, resources, and it's been a while since I've done my speaking. Skills, resources, and time are the greatest challenge. There has been some changes due to COVID that related to the resource. For some agencies, they were able to use the American Rescue Plan and the Technology Modernization Fund to do some of the support they needed to do in the pivot to remote work. So that helped meet some of the resource challenges. I think that once you were no longer in this crush of I just can't afford to get things done, and instead had this surge of, okay, we need to move to pivot to totally digital government so that we can do our services, a new challenge emerged, a new barrier that wasn't as easy to see before. It's been there, but it wasn't as easy to see. And that is the barrier of culture, your workplace culture, and resistance to change. So we could tell from that analysis that people said it was hard. This is the way we've always done it. There was concern about whether or not we can be as effective in our job if we don't have that paper component. How are we going to address, not needing a wet signature even from the head of our agency on a major policy? Other challenges that we learned, again, it's not surprising. We learned agencies had challenges. They talked about the difficulty of getting access to their hard copy records. They said, we can't get to the office, we can't get to our storage spaces, and yes, NARA and the federal record centers were not operating at full capacity. We reduced and went to an emergency capacity during the pandemic, so that impacted people's ability to transfer records. Again, the stories we heard in the comments that I'm seeing so far are the narrative story that says, I need paper, I need people, time, and money, and we're having problem with getting into the record centers, we're having problem with setting up contracts, we're having all these problems meeting of physical records. What's fascinating is I didn't hear the story saying, this is the problem I'm having on the electronic side. So the stories that are being told now really are focused on this inflection point, I think is a theme you might hear today. I think we're at an inflection point. We know that we've successfully built electronic systems and shared service systems, and we know how we're doing our mission. It's this transition of saying, but I had records that were created in the past, and they're still out there, and I'm having a hard time getting my arms wrapped around the paper problem. I think we're doing pretty good with the electronic part. So I just thought that was interesting to share. And as I step back and think of where we were 10 years ago, when, again, 10 years ago, 2012, we said, let's stop printing email. Let's stop printing records. I'm glad we've been in this posture. I'm glad this is what the government's been looking forward to, and I'm proud of NARA's role saying, yes, we want to transform. Because I can't imagine going through the pandemic 10 years ago and having agencies be as effective as they could have been, as we have been, at managing our records and conducting our mission. So happy to be part of that. I just said that physical transfer has been a challenge for agencies. So how do I know that? Not only do we know it through reporting data, we know that through the questions people give us. So just last month, we communicated to agencies an AC memo, and let me talk about that. We saw from the data that agencies would need some exceptions. We saw from the data they were having physical problems meeting the physical targets. That's important. One of the things that was out there is I want to physically transfer records to the National Archives. Either transfer records to the federal record centers, or I'm going to transfer records to the National Archives, give you my permanent materials. And that's important because agencies are trying to meet the deadline. If they can get paper records into the federal record centers before the deadline, they're not required to digitize those materials. Those inactive records can stay there. They will eventually be destroyed, or they will eventually be sent to NARA. And when they are, NARA assumes legal responsibility, and we assume responsibility for providing access to those records. And that means NARA may digitize them in the future. So if I can get my records to NARA by 2022, I do not have to worry about digitizing, which is great. except for that it's been difficult to get records to NARA because we haven't been open and we are sort of resuming our normal operations. We've got some backlogs to transfer. So agencies ask the question and NARA staff ask the question, hey, what if we just got the paperwork done? What if we use NARA's systems, and it's ARCIS is the system that's used to transfer records to the federal record centers. ERA, the Electronic Records Archive, is what's used to transfer records to the National Archives, become part of the U.S. National Archives. What if we just got the paperwork done? Can we agree that that's what we're going to do, and then let me transfer those records to you in 2023 or 24, however that works, however long it takes us? And the answer is yes. Yes, we can do that. Our executive, Lawrence Brewer, I've heard Jay Traynor, I heard our record center director say that in the past at bridge meetings. And so it was sort of, yes, you can do that. But I wanted to put something in writing. It seemed important to give somebody something in writing. They can say, yes, this agreement was there. So we just issued an AC memo. These are formal communications our office puts out. AC is actually our organizational code, so sorry for the acronym that's buried in there. We keep about 10 years of all of our memos available online. This is on our website, so if you didn't get the email, you can still find this information. And again, we think that this will help agencies manage the transfer process. If you want to learn more about how NARA is doing with physical transfers of records, I recommend you come to our June bridge meeting. Our colleagues from Research Services and from the Federal Record Centers will be there, and they'll be talking about the transfer of records to NARA. Okay, that is what we had to say. So taking the story, we know that the goal is there. We support the goal. We knew that we'd need exceptions. We wrote a bulletin. We know that agencies think they're going to make it either with exceptions or if they can just get their arms wrapped around the physical transfer, and we have a way of agencies managing physical transfer, getting the paperwork done if possible, and the physical transfer can come in a year or so. So here's for the main event for the rest of this time. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about digitization standards. M19 required NARA to issue updates to records management regulations and guidance by September 30th, 2020. We met that goal for temporary records. We have not met that goal for permanent records. In 2020, we issued a draft rule. It was December 2020 we issued that draft rule. It's on the Federal Register. It was out for public comment. And it showed our hand. It explained what is it that we want to do for digitization standards. For temporary records, that information's out there. The standards are very high. We're glad that we got them done because that covers 80 to 90% of what agencies are trying to digitize. And if I could just sum up the requirement for temporary records, when they're digitized, you have to be able to say the digitized versions can do the exact same functions as the originals. I can answer questions, I can be responsive to services, I can go to court, I've got the evidence if there's an appeal, if what's happened. It can serve the same purpose. So it's complete. You've got the data, the metadata, and you can tell your story on what happened to those temporary records. One of the reasons you digitize is to be more effective and more efficient and also no longer need to store the paper version. I call it scanner to shredder. I don't want to recreate and I don't want to store these. In those cases, I'd like to be clear that the original source records do not become non-record. They're still federal records. And so you need a disposition authority to decide, I've now got two versions. I've got the digitized version and the original source version. The digitized version has to be kept according to the retention period because that's now the record-keeping copy that we're putting our resources into. For the originals, the paper, we want to dispose of them. And I'd highlight that it is the GRS, the General Record Schedule 5.2, that gives that disposition authority. So that is the high-level temporary records. For permanent records, I'm going to say it again. The idea behind the entire standard here is that you will digitize this permanent record, this treasure that has already been identified as needing to come to the U.S. National Archives, and you will manage that digital image for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, then it's going to come to NARA and we're going to preserve that as part of our nation's history. That is the only version we will have in the future. So the digitization has to be good, really, really good. Because if there's a mistake, we'll never be able to go back to the originals and say, oh, well, yeah, I can compare. You're right. That was something, we just missed a few pages in the scanning process. Something got stuck or got turned sideways. There is no going back to the paper because we only have these digitized versions. That is why these standards are intense. That is why if you read that draft standard, it's very long because we want to make sure that we're doing as best imaging as we can. So what you saw in those draft regs are based on 3 pieces of guidance that are available now. It's the starting point. What's our output? What file format can we have on the other end? TIFF, PDF, JPEG. It talks about metadata. We still have metadata requirements. We love our metadata at the archives. We want to know what you called it. What was the date? Are there any access restrictions? Are there any use restrictions? Because we honor those when records come. We need to know if there was FOIA restriction. You can't release this information to the public. So we have this guidance, and we've said before, and I'm going to say it again, it's about FADGI. We are using the Federal Agency Digital Guidelines Initiative. I hope I got that right. FADGI has become an acronym I'm living every day. I am no digitization expert, but I know we're using this to help get those images at the highest level of quality we need. We're working with the Library of Congress, who is the steward of the FADGI guidelines. We are helping make sure that when you scan permanent records on modern office paper, that we've got the settings on the equipment's been tested, that we had the intellectual control to say, I need to know what I'm scanning so that I can know that there's a gap in the records because there was a gap in the records. It's not because there was an issue when it came to scanning that material. Another example I'd like to share before we open to questions is I personally am not as concerned about the DPI, the 300 DPI or the 600 DPI, because as I've learned, DPI doesn't help you if the image is out of focus. So we really want to look at imaging science and say, what's the quality checks? What's the scanner set up properly? Did it have tests? Did it do targets? Can we verify that these records management standards and regulations, they're really a quality management way of looking at the process, and have we met this every step of the way? So the last gift I'm going to give today is another sneak peek. Because what has happened to the standards is we got public comments in February of 2021. We got about, I'd say, 200 comments, depending how you slice and dice the question. And we've looked at the regs, and we took those comments, and we've made changes. Substantive changes that nobody has seen yet, because we have not yet finished our review, and we have not yet sent it to OMB so that it can be reviewed if necessary, and then published when it's final. So the standards are still draft. But the bones of what we discussed showed our hand in December of 2020 are still there. So what I'm showing you as a sneak peek, don't write this down, don't do a screenshot, because it may not be what comes out at the end of the day. But I just thought it was nice to see that we heard people say it wasn't clear, where did you want your quality? You had a quality management plan, and then you had a quality process. So we were like, yeah, that makes sense. Can we pull them together and have a section on quality management? Same thing, we had requirements for documentation spread throughout the regulation. We heard you. We can pull that together and say, here's what you need for documentation. We called it general requirements, but really they were records management requirements. So we tried to sort of streamline and put things together and make changes so that we were consistent, and I hope will make life easier. My takeaway is that the work we're doing on digitization regulations should make things easier and clearer, because we're being easier and clearer with our requirements. When will that be issued? I'm afraid I do not have an estimated time frame. We are working on it as best we can. In fact, I'll be leaving after noon today, heading back to the office and working again. So in closing, what can I say in closing? NARA remains committed to the goal of only accepting electronic records. The dates have not moved. So until they move, that is where the focus needs to be. Even if the dates do move, I would strongly encourage agencies to do their exception planning, to do their digitization planning. Don't wait for NARA to say, good news, we've got another 18 months to do, to get some wiggle room to get that handle around the physical records management. There's no need to wait. Do the plans now so you can ask for the exception if you need it, or you can ask for the resources to make a deadline if we can. Again, if I can get the paperwork in, we can transfer those records to the FRCs. If we need to get an exception because our digitization project is going to take us 5 years, you'll need that no matter what happens on the extension. So keep doing the work. The effort will not be wasted. And as we emerge from the pandemic with our return to office protocols and our new hybrid work culture, I think we're going to be in a better place to finish the transformation to digital government. What have I done on questions?
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. Appreciate that. And we've got some questions both submitted a little bit in advance and also on the chat. So I'll just plow ahead with them and we'll see how far we get with them. First question, couple of questions about this. Folks raising concerns, okay, I've got this 12/31/22 deadline out there for digitization. I have ambiguity in terms of the final date for the standards for permanent records. What am I supposed to do?
That is a fabulous question. You're supposed to do, how can I frame this better? Do the best you can. Do the best you can. Digitization has happened for 20 years before these standards came out. Digitization is going to keep on happening after the standards come out. So what I hope is that 2019 laid out the framework, things that need to be considered. What have you documented? What's the quality management plan? How often did you test your equipment? What was the sampling size? If you're doing your best effort, then we are going to end up, and we have ended up right now, here's the set of digitized images. We did our best, but they're not going to quite meet the standards because they couldn't, because you didn't issue the standards. And here's our original source records. What we need to make a determination is, okay, which version should NARA take? Because we said we wanted to only take the digitized versions. So our plan is to do an analysis and say, how close did that digitized version get to the standard? And really, it's what's the risk for NARA? Can we take those digitized images, that work that was done, and say, I've got the context, I've got the information, I can preserve and make those records available to the future? So here's an example. All right, we said grayscale in our standards, but you did bitonal. Perhaps the documentation analysis could say, yeah, we did bitonal because it was all modern office paper with very little color graphics. So it was the appropriate, they're not losing context. We could write an analysis, say, well, there's a very low risk that NARA is going to not be able to serve that to the public. Let's go ahead and take those. To take those, you're going to need a schedule. So it's our intention is to say, can we use our scheduling process? We already know the records are permanent. I don't want to touch that. I just want to say, yep, the disposition authority is send NARA the electronic digitized versions, and you have the authority to throw away the paper. Because that's what I think the goal is, right? Eventually, we dispose of the paper and we focus on that electronic version. So I think that's how we're going to get through this. I'll let you know. I'll come back in a few months and say how that's working.
A question here about scientific groups,
Yes.
and particularly this is one within NIH that has microscope slides and specimens.
Of course.
Is that considered a physical record subject to M1921? How does that work?
That's a great question. Generally speaking, physical objects are not considered records. I'd say generally speaking, you'll need to talk to your legal team in the agency to make that decision. For example, I remember it was my story that kills me was I was talking to the U.S. Geological Survey once, and they said, we have all these rocks that we've collected. You know, Geological Survey information, we have all these rocks, can't wait to give them to NARA. And I was like, NARA's not the Smithsonian. We don't take physical records generally, unless it was part of like a physical object that was in a collection. So I'm sorry, we can't take the rocks. And I'm sorry to say, right here, right now, talk to your lawyer first, but no, we're probably not going to take the specimens. However, the documentation about that the data that's supported with NIH and that is all information I think we would be interested in, scientific information. Always talk to your records officer, always talk to your lawyer, and then talk to NARA.
So the woolly mammoth is safe.
The woolly mammoth is safe.
Okay, good.
On display as it should be.
You might not know this number of the bulletin off the top of your head, but knowing you, you probably do. The person is requesting, what is the number of the bulletin regarding the paperwork done for the FRC transfers? All
right, you should go to NARA, archives.gov, and look up the Federal Record Centers. The number is AC Memo 32.2022. It just was the 32nd memo rewritten this fiscal year. So AC is our org code. I use that so to distinguish versus the OMB memo. You know, the M stands for OMB, the AC stands for our office. It's a formal communication. It's not quite a policy document, but it's got in writing the answer to the question.
Great. This relates to your comment about the 10 exceptions that have been requested.
Yes.
And so and this is a question that regards, okay, you look at that downward trend in We're Ready. You look at the question about the huge obstacle being money, time, and resources, and only 10 exceptions so far.
Yeah.
I guess putting you on the spot, do you expect a whole lot of like, oh crap moments in the next couple of months? And if so, is there a deadline for submitting a request for exceptions?
Let's do the easiest one first. There's no deadline. So I think that's going to be like, oh, you didn't move the target? Well, now I need to get the exception.
So New Year's Eve, there'll be a whole lot of these.
I'll tell you this, John. I'm still planning to take off December 31st. I'm going to have a nice New Year's. Like, in other words, I know there's nothing that's going to happen that last week in December that's going to save us. We need to be working toward, that's my goal. My point is work towards your plan so that you can learn if NARA extends the target, great. If NARA doesn't, I know how long it's going to take us to get there. It's difficult. It's difficult. And all I can say is for the first part of the question, I hear you. There's a lot of pieces that have to go in place. Work on your plans. Work on how much it's going to cost. Work on where you're going to be. That's what we want. We will take care of the exceptions as the time comes closer.
Great.
More information to come on exceptions.
Great. Thank you so much. You are always candid. We always appreciate it, and we appreciate your engagement with us. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, then I'm going to leave with my last slide up there. These are the ways to connect with our office, because, again, when we have information, we definitely look forward to sharing it. So thank you, John, and thank you, QAI.
Thank you very much. I'll give everybody a chance to just take a screenshot of this, so any of these ways that you might want to connect. You'll also be getting copies of the slides, so some of the links that were on there, you can expect to get that. So I'll leave that up to her just a second or two while we give you a chance to screenshot it. And again, thank you, Lisa, so much. So the next session is a really interesting one. Our speaker is Katy Perry, and Katy Perry, it's a different Katy Perry, so we're not going to have a whole lot of songs and stuff like that. And Katy, I'm sure, is very tired of those jokes. But Katy previously worked in the federal sector prior to being shifting over to the consulting side under the umbrella of KMP Consulting. And she primarily worked with NIH. In a whole lot of leadership positions. I think the part that I really like, because I've heard Katy speak before, is that she is a person that has an understanding of the realities of records management, but she also has a huge understanding of how records management fits into a strategic framework. And I think that's really an important consideration right now if this whole M1921 is going to move from a box-checking exercise to something that's really transformative in terms of digital government, as Lisa was talking. And that's the reason we do all this, is to actually create different customer experiences in the government sector. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Katy. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And again, for those of you that are listening and watching remotely, make sure that you view this full screen, makes it a lot easier, and then also make sure that you post your questions in the chat. Thank you so much, and Katie, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, John. Thank you, QAI, for giving me an opportunity to come and address this wonderful group at this great event. Sorry I'm not on site. I'm at the beach. So what I'd like to do is kind of take you through, records management readiness and just seeing how records management, looking through the lens of records management, as agencies and other organizations are supporting the M1921 transition. So what I want to do first is go through the basics. What is a record versus a non-record material? Look at records classification, inventories, file plans, and schedules. Then just touch a little bit on electronic records and email. And then finally getting to the point where how can you best support this M1921 directive. So the basics. Now, a lot of this information is pulled from the NARA website. They have so much good information. The reality is that a lot of your stakeholders, program directors, and others, they're not running to the NARA website. They're running to the records officer or records manager or liaisons or representatives to get a good idea of what we need to do in looking at records. And the first thing is really defining what a federal record is. And there are two words. If you come away with nothing else, just think informational value. When you're looking at documents, especially the paper documents that are being put together, look at the informational value in those documents. So federal records capture the activities, the decisions, the actions, the financial transactions that's conducted as part of day-to-day operations. They are kept because of the informational value. And they can come in a wide variety of media, whether it's paper records, photographs, electronic format. When you're looking at records, you have both active and inactive records. The active records that you're using are those that you're using on a day-to-day basis. You need them, they're part of your day-to-day operations, but you may have other records that are inactive. So basically, they have not met the retention schedule where it's time to dispose, destroy, or accession them. So you have to keep them. And that's where maintaining those records and knowing where they are critical things. Now, this is an interesting slide here. This comes from the NARA website. I just laughed when I saw it because I thought, wow, look at the graphics here. But it was amazing because even back then they had captured a number of different media. So when you look at the record's life cycle, you can see there are three areas in the life cycle. There's creation, there's the maintenance and use, and ultimately the disposition. When you look at disposition, it depends on whether or not the record meets the definition of temporary, which basically says that record has a shelf life of X, according to the schedule. Or there is historically significant information that takes it to the level of permanent records. And those records do not get destroyed. They get accessioned to NARA. So you really need to understand the difference between temporary and permanent records. And for the people that have called in that are records managers or records management specialists or experts, you know what they are. But a lot of people in your organization or federal agency do not. So it's very important to talk to people and let them understand the difference between temporary records and permanent records. So again, both types have informational value, but the temporary records have a shelf life. They are only kept for a certain period of time. Now, most federal agencies have their own record schedules that are also complemented by the NARA GRS or General Records Schedule. If you look at the record schedule, you we'll see many times the schedule will include language that will allow you to retain the record beyond the disposition date only based on business need. So that doesn't mean that you just keep these records in perpetuity because you like them and you think they might be great down the road. You might use it 15 years later based on a bona fide business need. So if you have a record that you are supposed to keep for 5 years and then destroy, but you are still actively using that record, if the schedule allows you to retain it beyond the retention period based on business need, you can do so. Remember, if you do that, you will need to have some type of trigger to re-examine and reevaluate how long you need that record before ultimately destroying it. Permanent records there are very, very few permanent records in federal agencies, and usually those constitute less than 3% of all of the records created. Now, the permanent records are those that meet certain criteria that they're historically significant. Let me give you an example of a permanent record. So back in the 90s, and kind of taking you back to the NIH days, there were several federal agencies along with the private sector that were working to map the human genome. So the research that was being conducted that ultimately resulted in the successful mapping of the human genome in the mid-90s, those records are historically significant. So a lot of the research that was done that resulted in this historic event, those would be classified as permanent records. So the laboratory notebooks and other information, now they may continue being used at NIH, but ultimately they would be accessioned to NARA. Once permanent records are accessioned to NARA, the NARA takes both physical and legal custody of the records. They no longer belong to the agency. They belong to NARA, and NARA is the keeper and owner of the record, and they need to ensure that those records are safeguarded and made available. Just as important as record material is non-record material, and I can't tell you how many supervisors, program directors, and others that would come to me and say, well, I have my own journal, or I have a diary, or I have a notebook, and as a manager, I keep notes, and those are my personal papers. Those are not records. So if there was a FOIA request, or if there was an investigation or other inquiry, would I have to give that information? I mean, it deals with some of my staff, but they're my notes. Well, the answer is it depends. If you have personal information that you're using, your personal notes, those are your personal notes. However, if you use those notes to make decisions or take actions, as part of your federal position, those become records. So remember, non-record materials do not have the informational value, and they are not applied as part of doing business. Your personal papers, those are non-records. If you're in a meeting and someone distributes an agenda and supplemental information, let's say some budget reports, you have convenience copies of those. You don't treat those as records. The record owner or creator treats those as records and has to safeguard the original records. So duplicate copies are non-record material, and reference material such as journals or catalogs or other references. So now that we've kind of touched on record versus non-record, let's talk a little bit about kind of digging in, and what do you do as you're working with your stakeholders across the agency or organization? Take the informational value and then apply those in terms of creating inventories, file plans, and applying record schedules. So again, and you'll get sick of me saying this, but informational value. When you look at informational value, per NARA, records fall into 3 categories. The administrative value, and that's the day-to-day, your operations, you're documenting activities, your actions, decisions. Then you have fiscal value, and that's documenting the financial transactions and obligations. This is really important because many times what will happen is that either the federal agency you work for or another entity wants to know who made the decision to obligate or commit funding for this activity or this initiative. And many times during an investigation, that comes up. And so it's very important to know that you have to keep records that have that fiscal value. And then ultimately legal value, so information that the law requires you to create as part of conducting business. So once you determine the informational value, then in order for you to really know kind of the landscape of the records created in your organization, start by creating a records inventory. So the records inventory is not every single record that's being created. You're looking at big buckets or series or categories of records. Let's say administrative operations versus facilities versus contracts and acquisitions. Look at those big buckets or categories so you can get started on developing the inventory based on the types of records that are being created. So this information will ultimately be used to develop file plans and apply schedules. Whoever is conducting the inventory works and decides what information is needed as you're putting your inventory together. So basically, not just the types of records that are being created, where are those records? Who owns those records? Are they in paper or electronic format? Once you get the inventory together, that's when you can create the records file plan. The file plan is different from the inventory because that identifies the actual records that are managed in accordance with the schedule. So let's say in your inventory, you have financial records. Now, when you put together the file plan, a budget office might have 7 different types of financial records. So the file plan would identify what those record types are. And also, when you put a file plan together, it makes it easy to know not just what you have, but where you have it. And then you can apply the record schedule so you know how long the records must be kept. A lot of people, and it's really interesting, and even when I was first in government, I hadn't really heard the term record schedule. I was working as an administrator, and I would say, well, how long do we need to keep this record? Well, Jenny's been here for 25 years, and Jenny says, just keep those records for 3 years and then just trash them, get rid of them. It doesn't matter. We don't need them for any more than 3 years. Wow, okay, does that apply to all the records? Yes, all administrative records, keep them for 3 years. Okay, well, Jenny is probably not correct. And Jenny is probably applying some schedule from back in the 70s or maybe 80s. So what's really important is to understand what a record schedule is. And it is a mandatory, either it's a policy document or a directive that states, the disposition instruction for all of your records. And that's in all media types. So, take a look at the record schedule that you have in your organization, because some record schedules have not been updated in not just years, but decades. So you may have schedules in place that only apply to paper, that are not media neutral. And so it's really important to take a look at the record schedule for your organization, not just to determine the disposition instructions, but to see, is it media neutral? Does it apply? You cannot destroy records that do not have NARA approved schedules. So it's very important to know that, especially as you are working on either digitization efforts or anything related to M1921, paper to electronic. NARA has the general record schedule, and I've included the link to that with the mandatory instructions for record schedule, and that's also known as a GRS. So you can see the bottom the bottom bullet includes all of the areas in the GRS. So finance, HR, technology, information management, general operations, and mission support. Well, your agency may have other big bucket areas, which is why a lot of the agencies have their own record schedules, but you can certainly use the GRS. So moving on to electronic records and email, let's talk a little bit about managing electronic records, metadata, and email records. So managing electronic records, again, information coming directly from NARA, store records in electronic media that are accessible and secure. And that is a big, big thing to remember, because a lot of people, I can remember when I was in the federal sector and people would say, wow, we just had, a purge day and we got rid of things, or we put everything in the cloud, or we put things on, external drives and we'll figure it out later. And I was like, well, what does that mean? What do you mean you're going to figure it out later? We know what that means. That means you took information you think you don't need and now it's somewhere. So it's really important to just consider and share with your stakeholders that you need to incorporate records management in design, development, and implementation of electronic systems, establish record management controls. And looking at NARA, the controls that they've identified are reliability, authenticity, integrity, usability, content, context, and structure. Sounds logical, but sometimes, when a program is really looking at the elements of an electronic system that is being developed, they're not necessarily thinking records management. And so I think this is why it's very important in the very early stages of system development to get the records managers at the table. And then prepare for the migration of records into a new system and ensure that they are available when the system is retired. I can't tell you how many times, I would hear a new system is coming on board, replacing something else. And we ask, well, where are those records? We're going to continue needing access to those records. So moving on to metadata, basically metadata provides information explaining what each record contains. For years I had heard about metadata. And I'm thinking, what the heck is metadata? I'm sorry, I'm not an IT person. Could you explain, please? And so what's nice is, again, NARA providing such, rich information. It's good to know in layman's terms, okay, what does the record contain? Talk about what it was recorded on, the instructions, the digitization process. Capturing the information using metadata makes it much easier to track, secure, maintain the information. And so the last slide I have, what I thought was very important, capture the information about original source records and about the digitization steps. NARA doesn't have the original source records when they take custody. So if you have taken something and you have digitized it, just make sure you have the appropriate metadata. So the types of metadata, well, these are some, not all, are administrative, used to manage records and relate them to one another, descriptive, describing the records or the set of records, and embedded binary data that exists. Technical describes the process used to create the electronic files and the parameters. So that touches on the electronic systems, but one thing to keep in mind is pay attention when a system is being sunsetted, or if you've been told that, you were directed because your system was no longer on a safe platform. Just pay attention to the records that are in the existing system that will be either sunsetted or retired, because you may have a system that is being retired at the end of this fiscal year, but contains records that you need access to for another 2 years before they can be eligible for destruction. So when you're working with leadership in your agency or organization, that's something to consider. That, if you are a records manager, you are responsible for safeguarding that information, or at least providing advice so the record or systems owners are safeguarding that information. So let's talk about Capstone for a minute. And this was really interesting about, just trying to manage email when, as a Fed, when I was working at the NIH, and we were talking about how we would manage Capstone, NARA really started getting good information and guidance together for the Capstone approach. So the federal agencies, adopted Capstone, for the most part, have adopted the Capstone approach for managing emails. And I remember when we were asked to identify Capstone officials, those officials were at the highest level of the agency. So we thought, okay, at this particular agency, we had 27 institutes and centers, 52 offices under the Office of the Director. So we had 200 positions identified. And, the response was, oh, no, that's just too many positions. We want the highest level. It took probably around 6 months till we could really hone in on the highest level officials, and ultimately it was just under 50. But the Capstone officials identified those emails were kept as permanent. Everyone else is a non-Capstone official. So when you start talking, at least in the federal sector, about email records management, primarily you're talking about non-Capstone officials. Those are marked as temporary records, and per NARA, they're held for 3 or 7 years, and the federal agencies have worked with NARA on how Capstone is being adopted in their federal agencies. For the one that I worked in, it was 7 years. And remember, record material is kept. So if you receive an email that says, hey, the fitness center is going to have yoga classes next Tuesday, come on down, that's not a record. Remember, informational value. Might be important to you. No, doesn't meet the criteria of informational value. So even though those records are kept for 3 to 7 years for non-Capstone officials, if there is email that is tagged as part of e-discovery for litigation or litigation hold, that cannot be destroyed. Even if it is up for destruction according to the record schedule, all emails identified as part of a litigation hold has to be kept until the litigation hold is lifted. So let's talk for a minute about M1921. So first things first, let's deal with the paper, and then what can we do to better support the organization? This slide should be familiar to everyone. First things first, it's time to tackle the hoarders. If you have been in any agency and you walk around, you are going to see offices with so much paper, it's a fire hazard. And these are the people that say, I need this paper. I can't get rid of this paper. It's important to me. And so understanding the frustration that you may have, the apprehension that they may have, how do you come together and deal with this situation? This is a situation I see everywhere. So I think in order to meet the mandate and get rid of the paper, then have them understand what that means. You determine the informational value of the documents, and then you're going to do one of three things. You're either going to digitize, you're going to destroy in accordance with the approved record schedule, or for permanent records, you will accession them. And so this is where it's so important. All of those other slides, if you're a records person, you may know all of this, but chances are your stakeholders do not. And so it's important for them to know as you're going through the records or they're going through the records that they understand what a record schedule is, what a record is. If there's something of historical value that would meet the definition of permanent record, those are the things that you would need to really sit with them and explain to them, which is why promoting records management is so important. The best thing to do is communicate. Work with your agency office staff in the private sector, work with the stakeholders. You may have an organization, a national organization where you've got field offices everywhere. And even though as a private entity, you may not be impacted by M1921, you certainly are impacted by paper records and some of the visuals I just showed you. So talk about record and non-record materials. Talk about the importance of putting together these inventories and file plans. Let people know what record schedules are and their responsibilities, because if they create records, they have responsibilities. And then it's important to actually help to facilitate migration of paper records and processes to an electronic processor environment, and then incorporate records management requirements when developing or enhancing IT systems. And I think that the last bullet is very important because it's not just engagement with the stakeholders, it's also engagement with IT. Partner with your IT developers, partner with your administrators, find a way where, to the extent you can, incorporate records management. So with that, again, I want to thank you for your time and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Katie. That was terrific. I really appreciate the comments. And as I said in the introduction initially, I always like the fact that you bridge that gap between the tactics of records management and the strategy of managing information. And so the first question I have is one that I wanted to touch on, and I think you raised a really important point that I think people often miss, which is that point about the 3% of records being permanent records, because I think people sometimes use records in this just generic kind of a way. And so if you could comment a little bit, think about maybe a pyramid, if you will, of information in any agency that goes from, information to business useful information to temporary records to permanent records, and just kind of the challenges of managing at all those different levels. Maybe just chat a bit about that.
When I think of pyramid, I immediately think, I'm on the Mediterranean diet now. So I'm not, I get that. I think, since most of the records, when you look at that, most of the records fall under temporary records. And you think of shelf life. How long do you really need these records? And so I think that, the inner workings of records management deals with the active records that you're only going to have for a certain period of time because there are so few permanent records. But it's the permanent records that become very, very important because of the value of the information, the significance of the information, the fact that you want to keep that, or at least have America keep that in perpetuity and get that in a safe way to NARA so it can be shared with others, is very, very important.
So here's a question from somebody, is that for a department in a federal agency, is the records liaison able to do one master file plan for the department, or do they include separate file plans for each supervisor within the department?
I would say there would be separate file plans. So, and let me give you an example. Let's just say if you are in a department and you have one area or office that deals solely with financial management records, then you have another group that is working on acquisitions and contracts, and another group that's working with research and development, another group that's working with, let's say, grants administration. If you try to put it all into one huge master file plan or even inventory, it's unwieldy because you'll have so many record owners, you'll have so many places where these records reside. It's easier to just keep them within an office or an entity.
Terrific. Here's a question here which perhaps I'll save you this because I don't want to put you in the position of appearing to recommend particular vendors, but examples of electronic records management programs and systems. So, and this is not an exclusive list, so just off the top of my head, you're talking about companies like OpenText and IBM, and talking about things that companies like Gimel do, and AvePoint, and M365 from Microsoft. And again, that's not an exclusive list by any stretch of the imagination, but just to give people an example of the kinds of companies that we often talk about when we talk about records management systems. So,
and may I add to that, if you don't mind, when if you're in the federal sector, you probably have, enterprise systems. So you may have timekeeping systems, and you may have, if you're in a department or a division and you are responsible for some function for the entire department or organization, there are systems that are built in-house using off-the-shelf software, and there are some that do a really good job and have records management capability. And so when I talk about make sure you try to incorporate records management, some of these systems already have records management capabilities. So it's important to kind of look for that, and if it's not there, to have it built in.
You had a really important point, I think, that you mentioned a couple of times about incorporating records and records management into the design of systems, which goes to the point that means the engagement of IT people in these conversations. And tell me about any lessons learned along the way that you've had in terms of how to square that circle and how to make those bridges with IT.
Yes, thank you. That's actually a good question. So again, putting on my former Fed hat, one of the program areas I was involved in directing was privacy. And so during the development phase for an IT system, there were privacy impact assessments that were created. And as part of the privacy impact assessment, you have to identify any systems of record notices. But there was no records impact assessment. So people were looking at the information that was needed. Did you have any personally identifiable or personal health information? But they weren't looking at, are we designing something that this system will create records? Now let's add a feature or a trigger so that when that record is up for disposition, there's a flag or some way to know that we're not having this system keep records in perpetuity until the system is either sunsetted or replaced in some way. So I think if you talk about some records assessment, a little more detailed than just providing a systems of records notice, that's what I'm talking about, the engagement between records and the IT developers.
There's a question here about going back to our pyramid of information. For M1921, how should agencies handle the non-records on site? Does M19 care about that stuff, or is that a whole separate question?
Well, the non-record material is non-record material. It's not treated as a record. And so if you have convenience copies, I think the bottom line, and I'm working with a client right now where we're developing a records program, but we're also trying to meet M1921. So we are looking at the requirements for M1921, but we are putting together inventories and file plans. And so as people are saying, well, this is non-record material. Well, that's great, but you can't keep all of that material here. Paper has to go. So I think when you look at non-record material, that's if they're personal papers or convenience copies, that's fine. But we're saying paper actually needs to be removed from the premises. That's not to say you can never print out a piece of paper, but that's the approach that, I'm taking with this particular federal client.
When you think about, I think about the inflection point that we are in right now with regards to technology change. And so how we are creating records now on a day forward basis is very different from the equation of how do you manage records that were created quite some time ago and you have to engage in a backfile conversion. Do you sense that that's a real struggle for organizations right now, trying to figure out how to address the stuff in the past and yet simultaneously embrace systems that can handle it in the future?
Yeah, I do think, there are a number of issues, especially related to the paper records and those that were created in the past that still are here but may be eligible for destruction. I think, in many organizations, you have hoarders that just don't want to get rid of the information. They just don't. It's important to them. And so they continue to see value. And this is why in one of the slides I had talked about taking a look at your record schedule to see if you really had a bona fide business need to keep those records. But I think people struggle because they just want to hold on to this information. And I think in a research environment, the kind of feedback I would get is, well, we were doing work on this. How do we know 20 years from now that it won't be historically significant? You're asking us to potentially delete or destroy information that could rise to the level of permanent. And it is a really, really difficult struggle. So again, you got to really take a look at that informational value, talk to the stakeholder or record owner to help determine what is the right thing for the agency.
When you talk about culture change, one of the issues that strikes me is that as we start talking about systems to automate records moving forward, that one of the challenges is the complexity of those schedules, and in records management terms, the number of buckets that you need to manage against, and in particular, the number of event-based buckets you have to manage against. Do you have any advice from a culture perspective on how to get more towards a big buckets kind of strategy when it comes to retention periods?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to not fall into accepting the I'm special approach. So I know that I was working on updating a record schedule that had 1,200 items. And when the team and I were looking at this, we're like, how could anybody apply a particular record schedule when you have 1,200 items to choose from? So establishing the big buckets really required engagement with the community. Tell us in greater detail what types of records you create. It's kind of like that inventory thing to some degree. But what was interesting was this agency was able to get from 1,200 to just a little over 350 items. So they were successful. However, I continue to hear, even now in the role that I play, well, I have a record that really doesn't meet, the definitions of the other. My records are scheduled or special. I need my own schedule. If you start falling into that trap, you will end up back at 1200. So I think it's really good to explain what the buckets are, the value of those buckets, because it provides a broader definition so a number of records can apply under each of those buckets. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, very much so. So this is an interesting question somebody posed, and it's kind of a chicken and egg question, is that when you think about this agency, their problem is that their record schedule is terribly outdated. You mentioned earlier, set up decades ago, and
Yes.
inconsistent with the kinds of issues that they face now as an agency, and yet they're simultaneously under pressure to modernize and digitize and adopt modern systems and all that. How do they manage, or what advice would you have maybe to help them manage that chicken and egg question of, should we modernize against an old crappy record schedule, or should we get the record schedule under control? What should we do?
So let me just be really blunt about this. People don't care about records until something happens. Nobody is going to take operational funding and give you $1 million to bring a team in and help with the modernization efforts. It doesn't happen. But then when there's an investigation or an inquiry or something happens where you need the records, where are the records? We need, it's critical. Well, it's critical, but you didn't really care about it a year ago. The reality is, if you have people in your agency or organization that you can pull together as a team to start working on pieces of it, that's the way to go, because you're not going to get a lot of money to deal with it. Bring in an expert to help facilitate that. But if you've got record liaisons or record contacts or people that are interested in doing that, or maybe summer students that might want to take that on as a project, start working on modernizing the schedules and get feedback and input from the stakeholders. Until you know what those big buckets or categories are, there's no way you can even start updating the schedule. But if you have a schedule that's decades old and completely out of date, chances are all of those record schedules are not media neutral. So if you have records that are only authorized in the schedule is just for paper, you can't just digitize that. You would have to update that schedule so that it's media neutral. So there are all these little nuances and if you can't get the resources to help you, then find the resources so you can create tiger teams or some special initiative.
One last question, Katie, and thank you so much for your time and your insights. I want to go back to that observation that Lisa had during her presentation, where we talked about this question that there have only been 10 exceptions requested, that you have that declining percentage of people that say they're prepared for the deadlines. And if you could just speculate, what's your guess? Is Lisa going to wake up in Q4 and all of a sudden get a gazillion exception requests at the last minute?
I think Lisa's going to have fun on New Year's Eve somewhere. I really do. The client that I'm working with, a particular federal client right now, we're looking at how many exceptions, and we're not really seeing any exceptions. And the client I'm working for is an IT component, right? So they're saying, well, we don't really have paper records. However, and I thought this was interesting, I'm working with their records office, and we're kind of doing the dog and pony show to go over a lot of what we went over in my presentation today, and then talk about a data call that we're going to send out, looking at paper records, looking to see if you have paper records or processes. But, the people that we've done this presentation to, what they're saying is, we don't really think we're going to need any exception. But, there are a lot of documents around here. They don't belong to us. They were left behind by others. And that triggered something totally different. It just happened the other day. And I thought, we're going to actually have to do a physical walkthrough of all of the areas, because when people leave, sometimes they leave their paper records behind. So you still need to go through those to determine informational value, and there may be something in there that would trigger an exception, but it's highly unlikely.
Great. Katie, thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. It's great to be back here again. And you're in for a real treat, I think, in the next 45 minutes or so. Paul Van Reed is the digitization manager, program manager for the EPA. And he's managing 2 huge in-house sites for digitization. He has a wealth of experience, including digitizing a lot of the Superfund archives, and has a very rich private sector experience as well. The thing that I think will be really fascinating is the kinds of issues that were involved in their decision to attack the M1921 deadlines and imperatives by basically bringing digitization in-house at massive scale, and some of the lessons learned that they had along the way, along that journey. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Paul.
John, thank you very much. And thank you to QAI for having me today. Certainly have enjoyed the presentations up to this point. Hopefully this will be up to that quality for the audience. My name is Paul Van Reed. I am the Digitization Program Manager East for the National Digitization Program of the Environmental Protection Agency. We are opening 2 centers. We are in the process of opening 2 centers to do national digitization. This is a shift from our regional approach to digitization for the agency to go to national digitization. We will be opening our center in the East later this year, just a few months out here. And for the West, we will be opening that center in 23. The centers are divided up based on, in general, based on paper volumes. Because headquarters has such a large volume of records, the East Center will only be taking on a couple of our regional offices, whereas the West will be taking on our entire, the remainder of the regional offices, as well as our entire Superfund program. Let's talk just a little for a minute about why EPA decided to go this route. What were the goals of doing national digitization? First and foremost, the agency saw it as being important to manage our records and information to accomplish the agency's mission. Our mission is to protect human health and the environment. It is extremely important to our staff. People grow up, people go through college, people aspire to come work at the agency, and because they take the environment and environmental protection very, very seriously. And like we say, a military runs on its stomach. An agency like EPA runs on our records, and we want to be able to manage them as effectively as we possibly can. Our agency, like many other agencies, are learning that post-pandemic, we will have something more of a hybrid model where people might not be coming into the office, or more people might not be coming into the office as frequently as they have in the past. And so if your record information is locked in paper, in file folders, in file room someplace, or file drawer someplace, it makes it really hard to access that information, because you have to remember on the day that week you go in the office or whatever that those are records that you need to access and look at. And if that information is digitized and available to you online, then you can be more effective and more efficient in accomplishing the agency's mission. And finally, we looked at it from a cost perspective, the cost to the agency of managing the physical storage. We execute our mission through 10 regional offices located across the country. And so we store those paper records in those locations. And for many of our programs, whether it's our Superfund program, our air program, our water program, or any of our other programs or pesticide program, many of those records not only have very, very long record retention periods under the schedules, but they remain open for, in some cases, decades, because it takes that long to determine what the proper cleanup strategy is for a Superfund location or something of that nature. So these records have to be available to the people in our regional offices that are executing the mission of the agency. And because of that, it creates a lot of physical storage in our regional offices. And then there are costs to managing those records in place while they exist there in paper. So those are the things that the agency looked at in terms of deciding on a national digitization strategy. Once you get our goals, once you get to past the goals, then you've got to look at the strategy of, how are we going to go about this? First and foremost, the objective is destruction of the physical source paper records. That means we have to build a program that is in compliance with the NARA regulations. Lisa talked earlier in the first presentation today, Lisa talked about where they're at with the regulations, and that, these regulations were intended and designed to allow for those source paper records to be disposed of. This in terms of, I think she used the term scanner to shredder. I like that term. It's for some heard it well, but scanner to shredder. And so we have to make sure that we're building a program that complies. Our strategic goal has to make sure that it complies with the NARA regulations for that. We need to analyze, is the best strategy for the agency to go internal to do this program, which is the direction that we ultimately decided to go, or to go external. And then the criteria that we looked at for that, the factors that we looked at in making that decision, was statutory and regulatory considerations. The Environmental Protection Agency does not typically, in general, I mean, there are exceptions to this, of course, but in general, we do not generally traffic in national security classified information, confidential, secret, top secret type of information. We do have a whole lot of very, very, very sensitive information, controlled, unclassified information that we take very seriously. We had to look at the impact of being able, what the issues were, the sensitivity issues were with regard to allowing those records to go outside of the agency. Cost considerations. What would the costs be of going to third-party organizations for the digitization versus building internal organizations to do it? And then also our agency structure and culture. How will we structure? We're structured in a sort of dispersed manner across the country, number one. And what were the cultural considerations? As I say, these records remain open for, in many cases, decades. And people need, they're very sensitive to needing to be able to access maybe a record from 20 years ago or something like that. And so they're very attached. I think Patty talked about, I just need it. I just need the paper. They're very attached to the paper and sensitive, very, very sensitive to, if it goes out of their hands, where's it at and can I get it back? Or can I at least get the information back? And those cultural considerations. So we had to take that into account as a factor in terms of building the program. And then also from a strategy point of view, what technologies were available at the time to meet NARA's requirements. We actually started moving in this direction a bit over 3 years ago. And when you talk about things like FADGI and automatic document feed scanners and that were capable of FADGI and all that kind of stuff, that was an issue. And we had to understand that and make sure that we built it into the program, understood how it was going to impact us from a strategic decision-making standpoint. So then looking at the implementation, given those strategic directions of deciding to do it internally, what the cultural aspects of it all were, we looked at what are the considerations in implementing the project. Well, first we needed policies and documented operating procedures so that people could understand how are you going to go about this? What do I need to do? How does this impact me at the staff level, at the management level, at the program level, at the records liaison level? All those things. There had to be documented policies and standard operating procedures that people could examine and understand those factors and make sure that they were compatible with existing agency directives and procedures and everything that fit into the model, all the models that already existed out there. And then, secondly, what is your communication strategy? How do you help your agency about, give or take, somewhere between, depending on which numbers and which year you look at, somewhere between 15 and 18,000 people in the agency? How do you communicate? Because this is a very individual thing. Federal employees generate federal records. So those people, it affects all of those people. How do you communicate to each level of the organization in each geography exactly how this is going to impact them? So the communication strategy became a very important part of the implementation strategy. Then, as a result of deciding to take this program internal, we had to look at, how are we going to, what partnerships we needed for getting that done. What collaboration within our organization and externally did we need to accomplish the goal? One of them that was a very, very important and fit well into our cultural necessities, if you want to call them that, was the tracking of the records. In other words, if I give you this piece of paper or digitizing it, and I need to get it back before you digitize it, do we know where it's at? Can we find it in that process? And can I get it back if I need it? If I need it, what if I get involved in a litigation where I have to have that paper available to me? Is it marked as it goes through the process that it is subject to litigation hold? All those kinds of considerations. So internally, our records management technology team built a very effective tracking tool that we call the paper asset tracking tool that actually tracks the paper from the regional office right through the transportation process. It reaches out to the various transportation organizations to find out as the tracking comes through where that is at, and then it tracks it all the way through our internal digitization facilities. And that takes me to the next point. We needed facilities to do it in. NARA has standards for facilities. I am speaking to you today from Edison, New Jersey, where our National Digitization Center East is located, and that facility is being completed right now. So to give you an example of a basic NARA requirement in that kind of you've got temperature sensitivities, because there are going to be permanent records in there, humidity sensitivities. You actually are required to have things like an interlock door. If you come in our receiving, through our receiving port, you come into a vestibule where the one door closes behind you before the next door will open in front of you. And these are all requirements of a facility that is going to hold those records while they are in the process of being digitized. Then there's the scanning technologies. What is this going to cost? What is available to us? One of the things that we included in our acquisition process was that they had to meet the FADGI standards. Are the FADGI standards the current? Is the permanent record regulation published, as Lisa was talking about yet? No. Did she say the bones of what was published as the draft regulation exists? Yes. Did she talk about FADGI? Yes. Did she talk about that being an important thing for permanent records? Yes. And I might add, for the Environmental Protection Agency, our record schedules, Patty talked about, Katie, I apologize. Katie spoke about the 3% number, and I learned that 3% number of federal records are permanent records. I learned that in one of my KSA classes back when NARA used to give out those certificates. That's not true for the Environmental Protection Agency. A much higher percentage of our overall records are permanent records because they relate directly to the environment, the ground, the dirt, the air that make up the United States of America. So we had to look at that, the scanning technologies that existed and we could acquire, and we did require that FADGI to be a part of any of the scanning technologies that we acquired. We did some early experimentation with some early vendors who claimed that they could do FADGI, and it turned out they couldn't. I'm not going to name any names, but it turned out that they couldn't. Now, those companies are not, some of those companies are not still in the scanning business, but I would just say that, it was an important thing to us to make sure that we stipulated that our scanning technologies actually met that FADGI level. And then the operational staff. Who's going to do this scanning? How are we going to acquire the staff with the background and the information, the knowledge to know how to run an operation like this, work in an operation like this, be successful in an operation like this? And then we had to acquire the knowledge ourselves. I've been doing scanning for a number of years in the Superfund program, as John mentioned. Our manager of the West Center, Jolene Kieschlik, has been scanning in our Region 7 office for probably 12 or 15 years. So she's got a lot of knowledge in terms of how to run a scanning operation and all those kinds of things. But we didn't scan to FADGI standards in the past. We didn't scan using the quality standards that have now been built into the draft regulation for permanent records. So we needed to, if we were going to implement these programs, we needed to acquire knowledge in all of these areas so that we would be able to be effective in terms of actually implementing the program. So what does it take? We are months away from opening our first center, and just a little bit further on opening our second center. And so at this point, we know something about what it takes to build a successful digitization program in an agency. We have some experience with that, if you want to call it that. And the first thing and foremost, and this is not unusual, if you read any information governance document, textbook, manual, it always says you need senior leadership commitment. Digitization is absolutely that on steroids. This initiative started from our CIO. Our CIO looked at the records situation and found that if we were going to get to digitization, we were going to need, he was going to need to make that one of his big, important goals. And because he did, and our deputy CIO took it on as well as very important, one of their very important goals, we are here today about ready to open our first center and soon to open our second center. We are also very fortunate that we have directors and managers with subject matter expertise. So if you talk to them about needing some aspect, of the center, why you need this or why you need that, they get it right up front. It's not like scanning is foreign to them, or like it so commonly is in so many agencies. Just go scan that. I mean, can't you just take it, put it in the hopper, comes through, it's scanned, it's fine, leave it alone, throw it away, whatever you want to do with it. They need to have records expertise. They need to have some scanning technology and experience expertise. And we were very, very fortunate to have office directors and division directors in our organization that had that expertise so that we could talk to them in a very intelligent way and that they could understand what we were trying to communicate to them. You need a team of experts, and as I had mentioned, subject matter experts. As I mentioned, Jolene Kisick, who will be managing our West Center, has been scanning for the agency for many years, has many years of experience in digitizing operations and running successful digitization operations. Evergen Peralta Cruz, who is in our headquarters, has a combination of project management and communications experience, which is the things that we needed to get to the point we're at today. And Kevin Kirby, who's detailed on our team right now, is an information architect. So he understands all of the technology interconnect points and things of that nature. Our agency records officer, John Ellis, was extremely important to the process in terms of making sure that the policies were there. The policy issues were addressed and dealt with at an agency level, that the records liaison officers were being communicated with effectively and were brought into the process, if you want to look at it from that standpoint. And our records management technology team, as I said, one of the things that they've done is implement our paper asset tracking tool, which is central, necessary in order to be able to build an operation like ours. At the same time, an EPA is taking a three-pronged approach to this whole process, and that is, prong one is policy. John Ellis, our records officer. Prong number two is a world-class records management technology platform. So Andrew Young in our records management technology team are in the process of completely doing our records management technology, bringing in AI expertise to the acquisition of the records as they come in and are fed into that system, and building all of the connections that are needed to both the electronic existing digitally born records as well as the digitized records, so they all go in seamlessly to the same. So and then we, the digitization, are that third prong that are converting that paper into electronic format so that it can be available to our staff and our agency to execute the mission and meet our goals. You need facility experts. As I say, it took a lot of expertise to build facilities that meet the narrow requirements, that meet our operational requirements, that support all of those needs, and have that kind of expertise in terms of how to build out those facilities and get them ready for us to, and there's no small feat from that standpoint. An acquisition support organization, our contracting team has been remarkable. I mean, they've had to buy everything from the pieces and parts of the building to the shelving to the scanning technologies that we're using, the scanning softwares that we're using, to the staff that we're using. So our acquisition support team really had to get in there and work very, very much alongside of us and support us in that effort, and they did. They stepped up every time. and they led the way, and it was fantastic to work with our acquisition support folks. Our agency liaison, records liaison officers. We have records liaison officers in every program, in every regional office within the agency, and they are key to any kind of record success in our agency. And so we needed them to be a part of our team as well. Any agency, I think, that's going to be successful at that needs that level of buy-in and success to build a program like this. And then agency partners. NARA has been very, very supportive in terms of answering our questions, being available to us, getting through this process. GSA in supporting our contracting process where we needed their help. They used to be called the Schedule 36 team, the record management, but they have really stepped up. I've met with them directly on a number of occasions, and from the early days of explaining what we were doing to them following through, helping us with RFIs and all those kinds of things as we were trying to gather more information. I have to give a shout out to the Veterans Benefits Administration. That's the non-hospital side, if you will, of the VA. They have been scanning veterans records for a number of years and were really very, very supportive and really came alongside us very early in the process to let us understand what they did and how they ran their operation, how they built their operation, and how they built success into it. And so I really did appreciate all the insight that they provided. And as Lisa talked about, BADGE and all this kind of stuff, these kind of standards and processes to make sure that when you're capturing permanent records in the United States, they are at the highest standards possible. The folks at the Library of Congress have been fantastic, helping us, providing us with, they have some training resources and meeting with us to help us understand this whole new, for us, BADGE world, the standard, the quality standard for digitized material used to be, look at it on the screen. Does it look okay? No, it looks fine. Okay, it's digitized. There has not been, and really, I'm sure of this. There's not been any government-wide standards for digitization, and in an agency as diverse as ours, even having within agency objective standards that are consistently applied when it comes to digitization is a very hard thing because BADGE is really that standard, and BADGE really proves to you that you have an accurate. I think the early words that the Library of Congress used was an accurate facsimile of the original, meaning that what you were looking at on paper and what you were looking at on the screen were as close as they could possibly be. This goes into color spectrum, light spectrums, and all kinds of things like that, and that's what BADGE is about. And of course, finally, industry partners to deliver the technologies and the knowledgeable staffs that they had that supported our success. Industry has to build this stuff. The government's not going to go out and design and manufacture the scanning technologies and those kinds of things. There's a lot of expertise out there now. Katie, for example, is in private industry at this point, helping the federal government get through this kind of a process. So those kind of partners in technology and technology partners were a key to success in getting to the point that we are at today as we get ready to open our first center and really get this program off the ground. So with that, I can take some questions, and if you can indulge me for just a moment, I'm going to switch to my headset so that I can make sure that I hear the questions as John gives them to me here. So give me just one moment here.
Great. And while Paul's doing that, if you could just back the slide up one slide, I think that's a good jumping off point to talk about some of the questions that we had.
John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Paul. How are you?
I am well, thank you, sir. And how are you today?
I am just fine. All right, we've got a whole lot of questions, some live and some from the online category here. So first of all, could you give people a sense of time frame from the point of view of we're going to do this to where you are now? Months, years, decades? How long?
This initiative started 5 years ago, where we were looking at it largely from, to be very, very honest about it, in addition to the standards going on within the records management community, NARA and what have you, GSA has some standards that they are applying to our facility organizations, not only ours, but the entire federal government. And our facility organization started to look at the footprint of our, that we had nationally to use to store paper records. And in that process, they began to say, we can't, we have to find a way to begin to compact this. We have to find a strategy. Digitization and records wasn't their thing, but they're saying, we got to compress this. We have a mandate from GSA to start reducing the space. How can we do it? And that put together a group of people from various disciplines, facilities, contracts, records management, and IT to start talking about this and, how could we do this? Isn't there a way that we could digitize this information? So as you can tell, that predated 19-21. 5 years ago, 19-21 wasn't out yet. We were still dealing with 12-19. 12-18. 12-18. And so it has been an evolution over 5 years. We actually created the program, the National Digitization Program, 3 years ago. It has probably, that development, to be very honest about it, has been, that development time frame has been extended by the pandemic. It's just impossible not to say that. That slowed things down from a lot of perspectives in the sense that people were not in the office, and then we started to experience the supply chain issues. When you're going out to acquire everything, build a facility, and to stand up a digitization process, you got to get a lot of stuff. And some of that is long lead time stuff from a supply chain perspective at the moment, whether it's IT equipment, whether it's physical equipment like shelving and what have you. Just about in every category, there are some long lead time things that have extended it.
How about this question? You mentioned senior leadership commitment, and what you guys have been doing basically requires SMEs, IT folks, records folks, legal folks, FOIA folks, all sorts of folks to be on the same page. How'd you do that?
Well, as I say, this initiative started from the CIO and his office. And that's why that's such an important element. The CIO is able to work with the colleagues at his executive level to make them see the logic of this. He already had commitment from his facility counterparts because they're saying, we got to compress space. He was able to get, his IT organization to support us, records in, as most SAOs are, these are SAO, as most SA are for records, they are the CIO, or they're in the CIO shop. So without that, I'm pretty sure it would be impossible.
How did you initially scale this project? In other words, how did you determine what the volume of paper is that you had? How did you put some bounds around it? And how did that factor into the kinds of equipment that you chose to address?
That's a great question, John, which is probably a horrible way to sort of answer. But it's very, very hard, to be very honest about it. It's very hard for an agency to know the full scope of how much paper you have, particularly when you're an agency where some of that paper stays open for 50 years, kind of thing. Before it even closes, it may have a 30-year, it may be a permanent record that you need to retain for 30 years, and then you can accession that to the National Archives. And 50 years may be short. The agency is just a little bit over 50 years old, and the first Superfund site was Love Canal, New York, and we're still doing work at Love Canal, New York. So there's still an RPM assigned to that location. It is delisted, but it's still there. Getting that, we could get information on file room space, that kind of thing, but once you get down to the 4 high laterals and the cubicles and all that kind of stuff, you have to do some guesstimations based on your, what you can tell from your file room space, file storage space, average amount of files per cubicle and things like that. And so, to do these data calls, anybody who's been subjected to any of these data calls of how many of this item do you have, they're very time consuming and people are busy and it's hard to get them to provide that information. So we were able to know some of it and project some of it, and we knew already, just from the file room perspective, that it was very large.
How are you handling the disposition question now, once you digitize this stuff?
Well, we know that as we start to digitize permanent records, we do not have a permanent record disposition or destruction authority yet. Even if we meet all the requirements of the draft regulation, it still doesn't mean that we can shred the paper yet, because that regulation is not final. So we are looking at, and we probably NARA, to be fair to them, they're trying very, very hard to get this out. And Elisa said that. I truly, truly do believe it. It's not an easy process. It would have been very nice to have a permanent record standard out. We know we can do what Lisa mentioned, temporary records out. We have a policy, internal policy with regard to the agency that supports the regulation for temporary records. We know we can destroy the temporary records, and we built the process to do that. We built the process to meet the permanent record draft regulation. And so until we have that authority, we're going to have to retain that paper. And then if the final regulation, when the regulation goes final rule for permanent records, if it is in essence the bones of, Lisa, you use Lisa's word, the bones of the draft regulation, we should be in a good position to start shredding that paper as well.
It sounds like you're using FADGI 3 levels of process quality as a de facto standard, not only ultimately for permanent records, but for all of your scanning operations. Do I have that right?
You are correct. We are, the way that we are testing and confirming our scanning technology to for each ship is based on FADGI 3 star. So everything that runs through that scanner in that time frame, and I'm being somewhat ambiguous about that because the basis is one shift, but if anything happens during that shift, we have to retest. Is based the way we build our standards, which aligns with what we understand of the draft regulation. will go through at a FADG 3-star level. I was very excited. We've taken delivery of our first 2 IBML scanners. I went down to their manufacturing facility in Birmingham a few weeks ago, before we would accept shipment of those scanners, and they demonstrated their ability to pass the FADG 3-star test for both cameras, front camera and back camera, at about an 83-inch per second rate, which translates into somewhere between 400 and 450 pages per minute. And since they're scanning both sides, that's 900 images per minute.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I just as a personal aside, I think you're on to something that's ultimately going to be really important, because in the absence of really clear image processing standards out there, as Lisa said, just saying something is 300 DPI or 600 DPI doesn't really talk about the whole process integrity question of how scanning is conducted at scale. I think you're on to something, because I think ultimately there's going to be an awful lot, not just federal government, but an awful lot of RFPs that are going to start to include that level of quality standard in everything they do, just because they're looking for something that can verify the quality of the images that they're addressing. So I think you're ahead of the curve on that in a lot of relative to a lot of folks.
I certainly agree with you. I mean, we as an agency are subject to a fair amount of litigation, but there's all kinds of litigation out there, and as the courts get more sophisticated on all this stuff, that you can guarantee that the question is going to come up. How do you know that what you're presenting here as the electronic version of this digitized item actually meets some objective standard for accuracy? And FADG 3 for reflective material, which that was a question earlier about transit, or might have been about transitive material. But this is reflective material, meaning paper. You're basically talking about reflecting light off paper. How do you know that what quality level you are at? And FADG 3 does that for you.
So were there any kind of records? We usually think of records as being these nice, perfect 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper with no staples, with no problems associated with them. Were there any kinds of records that were particular to EPA that posed unusual problems or exceptions?
The list would be almost endless, John. You are right. I mean, what it meant was that we had to build into our organization, our centers, if you want to look at it that way, a team to do uniform preparation of the documents to go into the scanners. Now, we did not put it into the specification. If I were to do this again, I would actually do it, but we were very thrilled to see that the scanning technology that was selected for us by our acquisition folks does have a lot of dummy protection in it. It detects for things like staples and double feeds and you name it. It does a lot of that for you, which is for us a true bonus. But we've actually built the part of our staffing includes a uniform preparation team, so that they make sure that when the banker box gets to the scanner, the business end of the scanner, that those documents have been properly prepped to go through the scanner.
Flip it back to when you got started. There's a question here. Any suggestions or recommendations that you would have for specific training for agencies that are just getting started on this path?
Yes. A couple of things, because it was certainly enlightening for us. Learn as much as you can about digitization, FADG 3, drill into that. It's worth the time to invest and learn about that. The standard is no longer, how does it look on the screen? Does it look okay? It looks okay. That's not the standard anymore. Really, FADG 3 is the standard that is that objective standard that we've been talking about. We came into this not knowing. I didn't even know the word. I mean, I didn't even know what it meant. And so invest in learning about what is in that standard and why. Why is it in that standard? And then what does it mean? You really begin to learn some interesting things. You know, I've been scanning on this 300 dot print scanner for years. How do you know you're getting 300 dots? You know, just questions like that. So yeah, definitely do that. And then the other thing that you really need to invest in if you're going to do this, and it's in the standard, it's actually in both standards. It's a higher standard in the permanent record draft regulation is quality. Understand quality technology. There's a whole science built around quality. And that's something that I think has been largely omitted in digitization operations for a very, very long time is how do you know that what you got is what you thought you got? And learn as much as you can about the, ISO and the ANSI standards and all that kind of stuff. There's a whole science around quality. Learn about quality.
So I think there's a question here. I think I know the answer to it, whether your digitization centers will be available for other federal agencies. I'm guessing you probably have enough fish to fry within EPA right now.
Well, certainly I have enough fish to fry. But there's not a doubt about that. We are, our agency participates with other agencies, on shared resources kind of thing. That would certainly be a question, I think, for, at kind of the CIO to CIO level or whatever the appropriate level is for that kind of a conversation. But, it's not within the scope of my position to say yes or no about that. My job is to scan the stuff that comes through. And so I'll just leave that as an open question.
Well, Paul, it's been really fascinating and really eye-opening to understand the issues that go on in a real business context in terms of scanning in-house at large scale. And so just thank you very much for being with us today. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. Have a great day.
And we will get ready to tee up our final panel. So just bear with us for a moment while we change seats. Hold on. All right, I think we're ready to go for our final panel here. And what we really want to talk about here is something that I've heard an awful lot of agencies talk about, which is this question of M1921 provides a very visible and accountable set of checkboxes that agencies need to meet. And yet at the same time, you don't want to just do this from the perspective of meeting some short-term checkbox perspective. You want to do this from the perspective of business and government transformation along the way. So that's what we want to spend some time talking about here. And we've got two really terrific guys here to talk about this. The first is Scott Swiderski, who's Vice President of Intelligent Information Management at Konica Minolta and also President of Quality Associates. I've known Scott for a long time. He has a very rich set of experiences associated with what it really takes to get projects actually done, which is easier said than done, believe me. There's an awful lot of false starts in our space that represent instances in which people think this is easy and then realize that it's not as easy as they thought. And then our other panelist is Sushil John, who I have also known for a long time. He's Vice President of Marketing and Strategy for IBML. You heard their scanners mentioned in the context of Paul Van Reed's comments earlier. He has all sorts of experience, but I think the part that I really like about Sushil is the understanding of strategy ultimately begins with effective tactics and technology, and how do you migrate from those tactics and technology to something that makes strategic sense for the business? So I have some questions that I have teed up that I've asked them to give me some help on, and I'll also be going back to my computer at some point and seeing questions that you all raise, so make sure that you raise those during the context of our conversation. We're also going to have a little bit of a demo to just give you a practical sense of what this is all about. So guys, you ready to get started? All right.
Absolutely.
Question one is goes back to this question of check boxes. How should organizations be approaching M1921? Is it a project with a specific deadline, or is it a vehicle to encourage long-term transformation? And I think, Scott, maybe I'll start with you on that, and Sushil, if you want to chime in, feel free.
Thanks, John. First of all, I just wanted to quickly also thank Lisa for her perspective from the policy side with NARA. Katie's perspective around the records management best practices, and ultimately Paul's perspective of what it is that EPA is doing. I think the reason I share the thank you to all of them. Number one, thanks for participating with us. But two, I'm hoping to use a bit of what they shared to
Great.
help respond to a number of these questions. So really the question is this a project, or should it be approached as a project, or is there the opportunity to consider a much broader long-term strategy? And I think I'll start with a comment I heard from Lisa. Lisa mentioned that NARA's goal is to have a fully digital government at some point, and clearly that's not a project, that's a journey, right? And so I think that's one of the really strong takeaways. The other thing that I think is important to think about is the purpose of this digitization effort, at least initially, for allowing all things to become digital and ultimately uploaded to NARA, is to think about these projects within the projects, if you will, as an opportunity for improvements around accessibility, and not necessarily a space reduction type of an initiative. So what would the project be anyway? Even if you were to think about it as a project, would it be to transfer the records to NARA? And get them out of the agency's storage facility? Would it be to undertake a small or mid-sized conversion project? I think if you're thinking about it as a project, you're going to forever be in that project mode. And I think the commitment from an agency to consider a longer, broader strategy will help the agency to accept that records management over time will innovate to an electronic solution. And ultimately, not have to deal with so many little stop and starts, that the committees and the decision makers and the key stakeholders are looking for this longer, broader strategy. So I think the answer or the response that we would have, as you heard from Lisa, Katie, and Paul, and the expertise that we have with QAI, would really be to commit to a longer, broader strategy, which we know is in line with where NARA is attempting to take all federal agencies.
Yeah, and I think that's really an important thing ultimately in getting funding for these projects as well, is that nobody wants to fund records management just for the sake of records management. They want to fund it from the perspective of what can records management get me, and ultimately transformation is at the end of this. Sushil?
I think Lisa gave a great example with how they implemented 1218, and then how that has kind of helped them through the COVID process, right? In being able to deal with a lot of that stuff. And if that was really not done back then, they would have had a lot more of issues now, even dealing with those electronic records. So clearly, M1921 is just another step in the process from a long-term digital transformation perspective. I think COVID highlighted for all organizations alike, whether it's in government, whether it's in the private sector, wherever it is, or the commercial, that digital transformation is important and is accelerated sense. So clearly, I see it as a long-term strategy, long-term initiative for any government department embarking on this. And there are milestones to achieve along the way, right? We heard through the conversations here about, I think we had some really great questions about how do we deal with some of the backlog versus going forward. And I think these are all just different milestones to develop as we go along in the project. But ultimately, it is a long-term digital transformation project that the government is embarking on.
So my second question is, it ties with what we were just talking about with Paul Van Reed, is this question of FADGI-3. And it's amazing how something has gone from something that nobody has heard of to all of a sudden, we all trot out FADGI-3 like it's, rolls off the tongue so easily. But talk, Sushil, about, you guys have invested a lot of time and effort, as has Scott, in thinking about FADGI-3 moving forward. Why is it important? What are some of the issues? Talk a little bit about that question of image quality and what
Sure.
it means.
You're absolutely right, John. I think FADGI guidelines have been there for a number of years now. I think 8 to 10 years probably back when it was finalized. But it's got a lot of limelight recently, especially with the NARA standard specifying for permanent records you need the FADGI 3-star standard. I think it's been a little bit of an issue for people to get there in terms of scale, because some of the devices that kind of met this process or met this quality requirement is undoubtedly not meeting the standards from a scale standpoint. They were really slow, right? I think people followed the standard, especially for permanent records that were very one record at a time, one scan at a time. They were able to meet this with either planetary scanners or, those or flatbed scanners type of devices. But that will not suffice clearly for all the backlog of records and for everything that all the departments need to manage. So no doubt the hardware is important, right? Because the hardware is what produces the image quality. But ultimately it is processes that ensure that these quality standards are being met, they are being implemented. And at IBML, we've been working on, thankfully, we've had the chance, we've been in the government space and worked with a number of government departments for so many years that we've had these requirements come from the department, and we've worked on this for quite some time now, and we have solutions today where the department can have a comprehensive solution that ensures not just the image quality from the device, they can have the image quality at scale. You heard Paul say that our latest devices can do this at about 470 pages per minute. And we can also make sure that processes are put in place that this can be implemented in a very tight manner.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point there, which is there's going to be a temptation moving forward for people to put a badge on top of a scanner and say this is FADGI-3 compliant. And the reality, and you touched on this, is that this is a process standard. Hardware is an element in achieving, because you can't have crappy hardware and still achieve the process standard, but it is a process standard moving forward. And I heard Don Williams talk about this, who's kind of the godfather of some of this in some ways. And Don talked about, this is an effort to put in place tolerances that would exist in any industrial process to the industrial process of managing the digitization of paper. And that's really interesting. And Scott, I know you've spent an awful lot of time thinking about this in terms of how you incorporate this into your day-to-day activities. Any take that you want to throw into the mix?
No, I think Sushil, covered a lot of what I think is important from our lens too. But I think the point was made earlier. Where has this standard come from? How has it gained so much popularity so quickly? And then for organizations like us to put ourselves in a position to understand it to the extent that we can advise and consult our customers' requirements for it. So that's really where we're focused today. We're looking at the breadth of the products, the tools, both the software and the hardware side of the industry, and then the processes and practices that are needed in order to comply. So we're trying to accelerate our learning curve on who all these players will be, so that we can make proper recommendations back to our customer base.
Great. That's a good jumping off point for both of you. This is a thing that I've talked about for a long time in many content management projects, this question of people, process, and technology. When it comes to undertaking specifically a digitization project, talk a little bit about where the pain points are and where the biggest challenges are. Is it on the people side, the process side, or the technology side?
Yeah, and I'd like to focus my answer very specifically around meeting the digitization standards of permanent records, and Paul said how he's implementing it, not just for permanent records, but also all records in general. So let's start with the technology question, because that's an easy one to answer, right? So from a technology standpoint, the FAJI 3-star, we have heard it mentioned in our previous presentation, it's not just about the 300 dpi. The FAJI 3-star checks on multiple data points about an image quality, right? Its resolution is just one aspect of it. There is color balance, there is color spectrum, there is illuminance. There are so many other standards that the FAJI 3-star test targets are testing the scanner for. So first and foremost, you need to make sure those are passed and the image quality passes that. The next you want to make sure from a technology perspective is this is not something that you can use for one scan per minute kind of thing, right? You want to make sure you want to have multiple scans per minute so that you can really scale this process to apply across your organization itself. So that's the second thing you want to make sure from a technology perspective. And the third aspect is the next important aspect is really process, right? How can you implement a process in place that makes sure this is adhered to as a standard? So one of the things, for example, we have done within our Capture Suite software is letting an administrator determine how often a test target needs to be put through and made sure this can be met. So for some organizations, it might be at the beginning of a shift. For some organizations, they may say we want to do it every hour. Some organizations may say they may want to do it a day. But you need to make sure this is tested as per the period defined by the administrator from a process perspective, and then implemented itself. So we kind of force it on the operators to be able to do that and meet the standard. Not only do we do that, we also maintain a log and an audit trail for people to go back and check how often this was done. So this is not only helpful if you're doing it in-house, because you can verify that it was always run and tested. But in case as a strategy you follow to outsource this work to other outsource providers who are able to come in and help you scale your process quickly, then you can make sure the outsourcer also meets these requirements and you can go back and do an audit trail from a process perspective. And undoubtedly, I think people is today a challenge, right? Here I'm going to take a slightly different angle here, John, because from a people perspective, I think when Lisa showed that chart about what is it that's keeping you away from doing that, that really came people, money, and skills. And that's not the first time I heard it. I've heard it. I was at AIM a couple of weeks back and talking to a few agencies there. I heard the same from the agency saying, hey, no doubt we all want to do this, but with COVID happening, people working remote, and all of this, no doubt while we want to do it, it also made the problem that much more worse because we don't have the skill sets required to make it happen, and the people in the office is now required to make this happen, right? And even if they have the people, then they don't have the necessary skill set who understands how this is. And this is where I think we can open up this discussion to a technology. I mean, there is AI and machine learning technologies that you can train today to throw at a bunch of documents to teach it, hey, these are the different things you need. So one of the specific complaints we heard was, hey, people need to identify which are permanent records, which are temporary records, or how do you categorize them and how do you archive them, right? So you could actually teach AI and machine learning technologies today what context to look for, what are the tags to look for, what formats to look for, so that you can throw a bunch of documents at it and let it figure out for you and assist you in the process and help you with the people aspect of it. Not necessarily you need to have a lot of people to be able to do this job.
Scott, which of these three do you find, you've done lots of these projects, which of these three do you find that people typically underestimate and goof as a result?
Yeah, I really like the question because giving some thought as to how I'd respond to this, I would say that, people make process and people make technology. And for years, my background specifically is in large-scale system integration and managing of BPO centers. I would say if there's any one of these that's, I don't want to call it necessarily most challenging, but what's important to get right is to have the right people in the right seats. And so I think when you have the right people with the right skill sets, on the right teams, the ability to execute successfully on these tasks and these projects and these longer-term initiatives clearly becomes a lot easier than if you have the wrong people, right, with the wrong skill sets in certain seats. So my response in this particular case would be we are in the people business when it comes to providing service from a BPO perspective.
So let me continue with you, Scott, on the next question here, which is, Paul talked about one strategy, which is, large scale, bring it in-house, and that's one way to approach this. You have a lot of experience in a whole lot of different flavors of this. What are some of the reasons why an organization might choose an in-house versus a outsourced strategy? What are some of the options that are out there, advantages, disadvantages, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks. I know it's sort of three different questions all around something that the audience had just recently heard from Paul, but I'll try and tackle the first one. I believe, the justification from EPA's perspective was to have more control and to, be in the position of functionally providing an advantage for where these records are, and accessibility, I think, was key to what Paul had mentioned as well. Second question was, what are the disadvantages of this approach? Well, I don't really know that there's a distinct disadvantage. It sounds like, from Paul's perspective, that the EPA has spent significant amounts of time in their due diligence to determine whether to fully outsource or to consider an in-house solution. Mm-hmm. The only place that I would suggest might be a potential disadvantage, and not to offset all the other advantages that Paul spoke of, was scalability, right? Federal government has to budget for things that takes time, right? And their ability to move towards the things that they need with a sense of urgency might take more time than the way a private sector, private industry company could respond. So that would be maybe the only one thing that might, stand up as a disadvantage. But I know that Paul mentioned a lot of advantages that EPA plans to get out of their approach to build these two large digital centers. The last question, what other options are available to organizations that have short-term needs for backfile conversion? There's a lot of options. You saw Paul speak of the EPA's plans and intentions and the execution around an in-house solution for themselves. The middle of that ground is to consider somewhat of a hybrid approach where the agency's involvement is significant in the overall plan process, but at the end they're planning to utilize an outsourced approach of some sort to perform the actual digitization. The other approach would be to fully commit to an outsourced approach, and using private industry to help define the requirement with the agency, and then ultimately use an outsourced approach to the extent that that the agency would have no involvement in the actual processing or transformation or digitization. So, those are the three most common places to see what's involved in doing this type of work. I am fascinated with Paul and the EPA's conversation. I think it's a big undertaking. I think they have a lot of the right people in place to make themselves successful. And, there are multiple ways to go about this, and I think that the EPA feels very confident in the direction that they're going.
Sushil, one of the reasons for my cagey set of questions here is that I think my answer to some of these would be, it depends. It depends on scale, it depends on culture, it depends on, the nature of the senior leadership, it depends on urgency, all those kinds of, and competency. But as you think about this, what occurs to you in terms of this inside versus outsource equation?
In my opinion, John, I think the one factor that doesn't allow outsourcing is confidentiality, right? The sensitivity of the records that you're dealing with sometimes would just not allow you to do anything outsourced, right? But besides that, I think everything else could be addressed with proper processes in place, even when you outsource itself. So I don't see a specific disadvantage otherwise to do it internally. If you are somebody like Paul, who's been planning and working on this for like 5 years and you're prepared, I think is a great way to do it, because the knowledge required to be able to do it resides internally. It's the people that are there internal that really have that knowledge. And passing that knowledge to an outsourcer is sometimes not easy, right? So if you have the time and resources and you've planned for this, absolutely go in sourcing. But if you don't and you want to get started here and you want to do scaling, you could either go outsourcing and it needn't be full. It could be part also, because you could be dealing with documents that cannot be outsourced versus documents that can be, and it could be a partial hybrid approach that you could be following.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because, part of the reason for their success has been they were very prescient in terms of thinking about this and laying the groundwork, as he said, 5 years ago for where they are. And, the other aspect to this question I always find interesting is that where you go depends on where you're starting. Right. And that's a huge part of how to address this, which gets into this next question about change management, which is always the elephant in the room in all this. What kinds of issues do people encounter? We had Katie talk a little bit about the hoarder picture that she had. That's one obvious change issue as you try to digitize information. What are some of the other ones that are out there, just quickly, that you guys have run into?
So, and I think that clearly came out in Lisa's presentation when she said that was like the number 2 factor, the change aspect of dropping paper and going. And I was reminded of how Lisa said, right, like just dealing with public, sometimes there are people who need to deal with paper and we need to make that possible. That's like one of the considerations for exceptions she had mentioned. And I think the reality is that the people who work with an organization are also the public, right? So I think I call it the multi-generational aspect, for want of another term. And there are different people who would like to deal with things differently. So I don't think dealing with paper is necessarily going to go away, even internally. And I think that's a big cultural change for certain people. But paper is not necessarily bad, right? I mean, when you can digitize it and then extract the information from it and make it available to processes, and that's ultimately what the government is looking for from a process of digitization and making it all electronic records. So making that possible is what is important here, right? And letting people, whether it's the public or people within the organization who need to deal with paper, and until you have that generational change that comes about, letting them deal with what is comfortable to them should be the way that organizations follow. And you're never going to be able to take it away 100%, right? Just enabling processes that ensures that the ultimate goal, the ultimate transformation goal of becoming a complete e-gov or an electronic transformed government is not lost, and you can put the process there to make that happen and extract the information, will make the change.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's really difficult today to want to resist change. The likelihood that everything that you do, moving forward is going to be different than the how you do it today, whether it's, how you park your car, how you order your groceries, how you file your taxes, as Lisa said. So, inevitably everything around us is changing. And I find myself personally, one of the difficult things to do is to just accept that everything is intuitive and that you're just supposed to kind of go into the process thinking this will be simple, right? And so I think one of the change management challenges and issues that exists is the acceptance of how that process is intended to work. If you've been around a process for a long time and it has become your de facto standard, and suddenly there's this radical change in the way you go through that process, is it intuitive for you, or is it so difficult to accept because you're just unfamiliar with its path going forward? So I think that's probably one of the areas that causes a lot of heartache.
Yeah, I really love what you guys said, and also what Lisa said about generations and technology. I think right now we're we tend to think of technology change in terms of 25 to 35-year-old people, when actually, from a government constituent perspective, there are 4 generations of technology out there now. My mom is 91. I am in the 60s someplace. My kids are in their 30s, and my grandkids are just, becoming teenagers now. And what they expect from technology creates very, very different demands on the kinds of systems you have. Very quick answer to this question, Scott, is that I'd be curious, is kind of my embarrassing question of whether, what we have heard about submitting plans is acceptable versus having actual results. Does this remove some of the urgency of M1921, or is the urgency still there?
Yeah, well, I first of all want to tell you that I did specifically pull Lisa off to the side. We're broadcasting from the Hamilton in D.C. today, and I said I don't want to answer this question unless, of course, I've got your permission and advice to exactly how to go about answering it. But first of all, it's a subjective question, right? And I think Lisa was clear to say that this acceptance guidance that's being called upon from NARA's lens is the criteria to support what it is they're comparing to is really yet not been developed. So I think she said that there were a total of 10 plans that have been submitted, none of which they've responded to as of yet. But there was also that declining degree of confidence, right, that she had suggested is coming from the agencies that we're going to be ready by 12/31/2022. So I would say that the plan and the suggestion around the plan is probably a good idea for most or some agencies that don't feel that they're going to be ready by any means of 12/31/2022. But I think the consideration of the response that you might get from NARA may not be as straightforward or exactly what it is that you want it to be. I think that NARA has some work to do around how to take into consideration what these plans consist of and how to ultimately go about responding to them. And man, I really hope, Lisa, that I got that right.
So encourage everybody to ask questions. This is the last formal question that I will ask these guys. And it's also a bridge to the demo that we're going to do. And so if you have some questions in the Vimeo chat, put those in there so that I can run over and check my laptop. And we can tee those up right after the demo. And with that, let me turn over to you, Sushil, to talk a little bit about this question of AI and machine learning, and then let people see what this looks like in real life.
Sure. Thanks, John. So absolutely, as I mentioned earlier, I think AI and machine learning technologies can help people supplement the process of not having enough people to do everything, right? Especially with training models today, you would be able to train models to identify within documents, context or form, either it's visual or textual, be able to use both of those to train models and identify documents that are critical, that need permanent record maintenance or is of temporary record, or how do you even extract the metadata of them to accelerate the process, right? Especially we heard with shortness, I mean, not having enough people to do all of this, making that happen is important. But of course, the challenge with that question then really for organization is, hey, if that's really the case, I need to digitize everything. I really cannot choose. Yes, you're going to probably incur more cost digitizing stuff, but you may reduce your cost overall in terms of people that are used to identifying all those things that needs to be digital. So either way, you're going to apply some cost upfront in terms of identifying the records versus letting the technologies identify the records for you. I think the most important capabilities is classification and extraction, I would say, and the ability to teach classification and extraction engines what to look for within documents is going to be an important one to supplement the people within organizations itself from a technology perspective. I'd like to use some time. We've spoken a lot about FARGI 3-star, and we kept this to the end so that we have a chance to show people how easy and simple it is to implement, and some of the technology that Paul spoke about earlier. I'd like to switch to our Birmingham Demo Center at this point of time so that they can show us a quick demo of how to implement FARGI in the digitization process.
All right. Thank you, Sushil. Here I am at the IBML Demo Center, and I'm going to show you how easily we've integrated FADGI compliance testing on our IBML Fusion scanners. All right, so we have integrated the compliance testing with Golden Thread into our capture software. So you can set the periods on how often you need to test and authenticate, make sure your images are still FADGI 3-star compliant. You go into the scanning application, hit New Batch, and here we have a job that this work requires FADGI testing every day. So if the operator has not done their FADGI compliance yet, what we'll do is FADGI compliance testing is required before they can actually scan this job. Would you like to continue? Yes. From here, our FADGI compliance test screen pops up, and it's asking them to place, go ahead and do this. We're going to split to this screen. The FADGI compliance target, we're going to start with the front camera, place it face up, and we are going to feed. At this point, we are taking that target image, we're uploading it to the Golden Thread software on our network, and it's analyzing it for passing or failing. We get the green pass on the front camera, so we're good. Next, we're going to switch over to the rear. You're going to take the target, and this time we're going to place it face down to test the rear camera. And a hand feed. It's going to analyze it just like it did the front. And we have a pass on the rear. So now we have tested the front image, tested the rear camera, and this allows the operator to now continue scanning in that job. While I have you here, I'm going to go ahead and run just run some work real quick. Sorry, let me just go back and here. And here we go. So now you have a scanner that's passed 3-star FADGI front and rear cameras, and also is able to run at 400 pages a minute, 300 DPI in those settings. So, all right, thank you, Sushil. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So what we just saw there was a quick demo of how simple it is to pass the FADGI target through the scanner and ensure the ensuing documents are passing that image quality test itself. As I mentioned, we have, within the software, we can operate it to set a cadence on how often you want to run these targets, keep a track of all the passes and fails, and make sure that we have an audit trail itself in place to certify that the documents that followed that was all FADGI 3-star tested. And also you notice that with these scanners, we can scan up to about 450 pages per minute. So really, if you want to scale up your digitization operations, it's really easy to do now with the IBML scanners, at least.
So just a couple of quick questions that we've gotten from folks out in the field here. The first one, Sushil, goes to this question of the reality of AI and machine learning utilization in organizations. On a scale of 1 to, and then this question of like, how real is it? How prevalent is it right now? on a scale of 1 to 5, just gut sense, what's the level of maturity in terms of optimizing these technologies? Still at the early part of the curve?
I think very much still at the early part of the curve from a point of view of adoption within it. Ultimately, any of these technologies are pretty useless until you train them. So I would say definitely early part of the curve for sure.
And Scott, on your side, a question from the perspective of experience that you have working with an awful lot of customers. Biggest mistake people make along the way here?
Yeah, I pretty easy answer because we see it so often. I think the biggest mistake or the thing that organizations that we work with tend to overlook is time, complexity, cost, and people. And there's a combination of all those things really. I think that most organizations underestimate that initial piece, the time and the level of effort that's involved in taking on a large digitization effort, which then leads to, right, all the other questions that are helping to give the reason why it's time that carries such a key variable on what people tend to underestimate.
Great. I have a question here for either of you. It says, from a digitization perspective, what are the differences between transferring physical records to FRCs and transferring them to commercially owned storage facilities? Any thoughts about that?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Probably a cost issue, I bet, at some point.
Yeah, well, I think initially, obviously, there's a cost issue. I mean, let it not be lost that NARA is a fee-for-service organization, as well as anybody, of course, in private sector. So accessibility, I think, then, sort of then becomes the next criteria. Am I able to get my records back more quickly from a private sector provider, like an Iron Mountain, for example? Or does NARA, allow me to have, the same service level agreement and get things back as quickly? So I think there's a bit of an evaluation that goes on there. We see agencies doing both, and I know that they go through the analysis of trying to determine which one is better than the other.
Mm-hmm. So I had the benefit of having everybody's presentations in advance, and so I thought I would close with 7 tips for balancing short-term digitization with long-term transformation before thanking everybody. And so these are my 7 that I put together. They're not meant to be an exhaustive, overly conclusive list, but just some things to think about as you think about this question of short-term and long-term. The first thing is that if you're going to be successful with a transformation effort, you need to have very specific transformation objectives. Now that sounds like an obvious thing, but the reality is a lot of organizations that I've dealt with have very vague transformation goals. And if you have very vague transformation goals, your ability to achieve them will be equally vague. So second thing is understand more short term, if you're going to produce compliant data, what do you need to have in place? What are those constraints that you need to put around your processes? And Sushil and Scott both, I think that's where FADGI 3 becomes really interesting to me to start thinking about it, because it's like the first time we've ever really tried to put some hard image quality constraints around a very critical government and industrial process. Third thing is my it depends point, which is there's an environment in which bringing things inside makes total sense. There's an environment in which sending it out makes total sense. There's also an environment in which being hybrid makes total sense. The one thing I think that I would add to the equation is that often there still is a little bit of a mindset that digitizing back files is something that, your cousin's nephew out on summer vacation with a scanner from Best Buy can somehow do. And if I've learned anything over the course of time that I've been involved in the industry, this is a mission critical process that you need to treat with the kind of dedication that you really need, kind of dedication that Paul talked about actually in his presentation. Build short-term tactics consistent with your long-term objectives. match funding and funding sources with the level of effort. You saw on Lisa's slide there where she talked about the SORM reports, and she had all the things that were standing in the way of people being effective from a digitization perspective. And that one bar sticking out was access to money, people, and time in order to get it done. So you've got to match the objectives that you're trying to achieve to the level of commitment that you have in the organization to achieve them. Paul talked a little bit about this question of a steering committee, ultimately, that provides multiple perspectives. This is hard work in organizations. Legal has a perspective, FOIA has a perspective, records has a perspective, IT does, subject matter experts, and you're dealing with the very heart of how people get their work done. And so you need to reflect those perspectives as you build strategies moving forward. And then the last thing I think I will just add, and I'll ask maybe you guys for just a final thought from the panel here, is think about both a day forward and a backfile strategy. Because where we are right now with technology is there are lots of changes going on. And while there's overlaps between the two, they are very distinct strategies. And so often you get people that are either preoccupied with the day forward, and then they have all this back-end risk and ungoverned information that still is lying around their organization and all the cost associated with that, or they're preoccupied so much with the backfile conversion that they never get on with the whole point of trying to address how you keep this problem from happening in the first place. And that's where we're in a very interesting environment right now. So any final thoughts you guys want to have before I close out the panel and the conference?
No, I'll just touch on that last question you had. About what approach you should take. I think one of the key recommendations would be to find an organization that does or that has the capability of doing more than one approach. And I think what you'll find in the experience of working with that group is that they're not going to sort of pigeonhole you into the only approach they know, which is the one that they offer. Mm-hmm. Having multiple approaches gives the organization the opportunity to do what's best for the customer and not necessarily what's key to their internal strategy. So that would be my final thought on your last item.
Thanks, John. Firstly, I didn't get a chance to thank all the people who spoke before me, Lisa, Katie, and Paul. I wanted to take a moment to thank everybody for joining us today with QAI at this event. And my final thoughts really is, I think from a technology perspective, there are vendors out there that have created the technology to help you solve for this. I think as organizations, if you have the will to do it, and if you put the processes and people in place, we can definitely address these requirements. It's not an impossible thing to scale your digitization process and be able to meet some of these guidelines that the NARA has put out in terms of creating permanent electronic records itself. We can definitely help you with that. And the technology should be the smallest of your problems, and the rest of it is the bigger problems for you to deal with.
So my real thanks to all of you for attending. We had this idea that we wanted to do a hybrid event, and it's worked out, I think, amazingly well. Technology sometimes actually works on your behalf rather than gets in the way, and so that was really, really fun. And I really appreciate the insights of Lisa and Katie and Paul and everything that they gave to the conference, and Sushil